My name is Dr. Alastair Finch, and until recently, I considered myself a man of science, of tangible evidence and rational explanations. I hold a doctorate in marine biology, a field that, while often presenting nature's more peculiar wonders, rarely delves into the realm of the truly inexplicable, the kind of unsettling mystery that gnaws at the edges of sanity. My work has always been grounded in observation, in the meticulous collection of data, and the calm, objective analysis of facts. What I am about to recount, however, challenges every tenet of my lifelong dedication to logic. It has shaken the very foundations of my understanding of the world, and indeed of reality itself. My annual sabbatical often takes me to remote coastlines, seeking solace from the bustling academic world and an opportunity for uninterrupted fieldwork. This year, I chose a secluded stretch of coastline in the Pacific Northwest, a place renowned for its rugged beauty, its tempestuous weather, and its profound isolation. It was here, amidst the relentless rhythm of the tide and the mournful cries of unseen gulls, that my carefully constructed world began to unravel. The day of the discovery was unremarkable, at least initially. A thick, gray mist clung to the shoreline, a common occurrence in this region, blurring the distinction between sea and sky. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of salt and decaying kelp. I was meticulously cataloging tidal pool specimens. My focus narrowed to the tiny, resilient creatures that thrived in that harsh intertidal zone. When my boot struck something solid, yet yielding, half buried in the wet sand, it was not a piece of driftwood, nor was it one of the ubiquitous plastic containers that tragically litter even the most remote beaches. Brushing away the clinging sand and seaweed, I uncovered a book. It was a journal, or so it appeared, of a rather anachronistic design. The cover was made of a dark, heavily weathered leather, almost black in its current state, and it was bound with what looked like tarnished brass clasps. The material was waterlogged and swollen, the edges softened and frayed by its time in the sea. There were no markings on the cover, no title, no indication of its owner or origin. It felt strangely heavy in my hands, imbued with a certain solemnity, as if it held secrets best left undisturbed. My initial thoughts were practical, tinged with a professional curiosity. Perhaps it belonged to a fellow researcher, lost in a storm. Or maybe a tourist, a casualty of a capsized boat. I considered the possibility of it containing information that could lead to its owner. In a more somber scenario, to their next of kin. The ethical imperative to try and return lost property, especially something as personal as a journal, how weighed upon me. I carried it back to the small, rented cabin that served as my temporary home and laboratory. The cabin was rustic, powered by a generator, and its isolation, previously a comfort, now seemed to amplify the journal's unsettling presence. I laid it on the rough, hewn wooden table, the damp leather staining the surface. For a long while, I simply looked at it. The clasps were stiff, corroded by salt water. It took some effort and the careful use of my multi-tool to pry them open. They yielded with a reluctant groan, like a coffin lid being disturbed after a long slumber. The pages within were made of a thick, high-quality paper, yellowed and water-stained, especially around the edges. Miraculously, much of the ink, a faded, sepia-toned script, remained legible, though some passages were hopelessly blurred into abstract patterns by the seawater. The handwriting was elegant, almost calligraphic, but with a spidery, slightly erratic quality that hinted at urgency or perhaps a troubled mind. A musty, oceanic odor emanated from the open pages. A smell not just of the sea, but of something older, deeper, and infinitely more unsettling. It was a scent that seemed to carry a whisper of profound loneliness and an unnamed dread. My intention was to skim through, to find a name, an address, any clue to its provenance. But as I began to read, that detached, professional curiosity quickly gave way to a far more personal and disturbing fascination. The initial entries were mundane, almost disappointingly so. They detailed the weather, observations of seabirds, the mundane routines of someone seemingly on a solitary sea voyage. The author, whose name was not immediately apparent, wrote with a certain poetic flair, but the content was unremarkable. October 12th. One of the first legible entries began. The sea remains a mirror of gray today, reflecting the sky's somber mood. Provisions are holding well. The solitude, while vast, is not yet a burden. I find a certain peace in the endless horizon, a sense of being untethered from the world's clamor. I read on, my dinner forgotten, the generator humming its lonely tune outside. The entries were not dated by year, only by month and day, making it impossible to gauge how old the journal truly was. As I progressed, the tone began to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing alarm. The writer's observations of the sea became less about its beauty and more about its perceived emptiness, its vast indifference. October 19th. Another entry read, "The silence out here is changing. It is no longer peaceful. It feels watchful. I dismiss it as fancy, the product of too much solitude, but the feeling persists. Sometimes I imagine I hear whispers on the wind, just at the edge of hearing, too faint to discern words, but laden with a sorrow that chills me to the bone." A shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the warmth of the small wood, burning stove in the corner of the cabin. I told myself it was the evocative writing, the power of suggestion. I was a scientist after all. Whispers on the wind were simply that wind. But the entries grew stranger still. October 25th. I saw something in the water today. Not a whale, nor any known creature of the deep. It was far off, a shape that breached the surface for only a moment, too large, too unnatural. My charts show no land for hundreds of miles, no seamounts, no reefs, yet it seemed to rise from an impossible shallows. My mind must be playing tricks. The isolation is taking its toll. The writer's methodical, almost clinical descriptions of their growing unease were far more terrifying than any overt horror could have been. It was the creeping dread of a rational mind, confronting the irrational, a mind desperately trying to find logical explanations for phenomena that defied them. November 2nd. The dreams have started. They are not dreams of home or of rescue. They are dreams of the deep, of immense, crushing pressure. Of eyes that watch from the abyssal dark. Eyes that are not eyes. I wake up with my heart pounding. The scent of brine inexplicably strong in my bunk. Even though the hatches are sealed, I found myself glancing nervously towards the cabin's single window, which looked out onto the dark, tumultuous sea. The mist had thickened, pressing against the glass like a shroud. The sound of the waves seemed louder now, more insistent. The final entry I read that first night was the one that truly lodged a sliver of ice in my heart. The handwriting was noticeably more erratic here, the confident strokes of the earlier pages devolving into something hurried, almost desperate. November 10th. It is not the sea, it is in the sea. Or rather, the sea is its cloak. I have seen it again. Closer this time. It is not a creature of our world. It is ancient and vast, and it knows I am here. The whispers are clearer now. They are not sorrowful. They are hungry. I have sealed this journal in the hopes that if I am lost, someone might understand. Do not search for me. And if you value your sanity, do not search for what I have found. Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. Below this, the page was stained with a large, irregular blotch. The ink blurred beyond recognition, as if a significant amount of water had suddenly drenched the book at that very moment. Or perhaps something else. I closed the journal, my hand trembling slightly. The cabin, my sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a fragile outpost on the edge of abyss. The scientific objectivity I prided myself on was being eroded by a primal fear, a sense of having stumbled upon a truth that humanity was perhaps not meant to know. The journal lay on the table, a sodden, leather-bound Pandora's box. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me far, more than the damp night air, that I would not sleep easily tonight. And I knew, despite the author's desperate warning, that I would have to read on. The need to understand, to uncover the rest of this terrifying narrative, had already taken root. A dark seed planted in the fertile ground of my horrified curiosity. The nightmares, I suspected, were only just beginning. The hours that followed my initial reading of the journal were fraught with an oppressive disquiet. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by fragmented images of churning black water and whispers that seemed to echo the journal writer's dread. I awoke before dawn, the gray light seeping into the cabin like an unwelcome specter. The journal lay where I had left it, its presence on the table a silent, malevolent accusation. My scientific training urged me to dismiss its contents as the ramblings of a disturbed individual, a mind unhinged by prolonged isolation, hallucinations, paranoia. These were well-documented consequences of sensory deprivation and extreme solitude at sea. And yet, the sheer conviction in the writer's words, the chillingly methodical descent from rational ovation to abject terror, resonated with a disturbing authenticity. A part of me, the pragmatic, evidence-based academic, wanted to seal the journal away, perhaps even consign it to the flames of the wood burning stove, to treat it as an anomaly, a piece of unfortunate jetsam best forgotten. But another, more primal part A morbid curiosity intertwined with an unacknowledged fear found itself inexorably drawn back to those water-stained pages. The author's final plea: do not search for what I have found, acted not as a deterrent, but as an irresistible lure. What monstrous truth lay hidden in those depths, so terrifying that its discoverer would rather face oblivion than allow others to follow? With a fresh pot of coffee brewing, its aroma a small, comforting normality in the encroaching strangeness, I reopened the journal. The musty, oceanic scent seemed stronger now, or perhaps my senses were merely heightened by anticipation and lack of sleep. I turned past the last entry I had read, my fingers tracing the blurred inkblot, a silent testament to some unknown, terrible culmination. The next legible entry was dated November 12th, 2 days after the previous one. The handwriting was starkly different. The elegant calligraphy had completely disintegrated, replaced by a jagged, almost illegible scrawl that spoke of profound duress. Each stroke of the pen seemed to have been carved into the page with trembling force. November 12th. It showed itself, not a glimpse, not a shadow. I saw it. The storm was its herald. For 2 days, the sea has been a cauldron, waves like mountains. My little vessel tossed like a cork. I thought the tempest itself would be my end. But the storm was a distraction, a curtain raised upon a stage of cosmic horror. My own breath caught in my throat. I found myself glancing out the cabin window. The sea today was relatively calm, the morning sun beginning to burn through the mist. It was a stark contrast to the scene the journal was painting. It rose from the water during a momentary lull, when the wind held its breath and the rain paused. The sea boiled around it, not with heat, but with a displacement, as if the ocean itself was making way reluctantly. It was vast. No, a vast is too small a word. It was a geography, a mountain range of flesh and something else. Not scales, not skin as we know it. The surface of it seemed to shimmer, to shift like oil on water, but the colors were wrong, unsettling. Hues that have no name in our spectrum. I am a marine biologist. I have studied colossal squid, sperm whales, creatures of the deep that dwarf human understanding of size. But the description here, this was not biology. This was something that defied classification, something that belonged to an older, darker order of existence. And the eyes, God's the eyes! They were not on a head, for it had no discernible head, no familiar anatomy. They were everywhere. Countless, glowing orbs embedded in its shifting mass. They were the size of my ship's lifeboats, and they all turned. They all focused on me, on this insignificant speck of wood and cloth. And in their depths, I saw the age of the universe. I saw nebulae die and stars be born. I saw civilizations rise and fall on worlds I could not name. And I saw an intelligence, cold, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly alien. I had to put the journal down. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the cabin. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, acrid. I walked to the window, needing to see the normal, the mundane. The waves lapped gently at the shore. A flock of sandpipers skittered along the waterline. It was a world of serene, unthinking nature. How could such a world coexist with the Lovecraftian entity described in those desperate pages? But the journal beckoned. Its story was incomplete, its horror only partially unveiled. With a reluctance that was almost physical, I returned to it. It made no sound that my ears could register, yet its voice filled my mind. Not words, not language. It was a pressure, a knowing. It knew my fears. It knew my hopes. It showed me images of my home, of my family, so vivid, so real. Then it twisted them, corrupted them into scenes of unimaginable loss and despair. It was not merely threatening me. It was dissecting my soul layer by layer with an unhurried, almost curious malevolence. The writer's descent into sheer terror was palpable on the page. The ink was smudged in places, as if by frantic, sweaty hands. There were sections that were crossed out with such violence that the paper was torn. November 14th. I don't know how long I've been drifting. The engine is dead. The radio's silent. It plays with me. It appears and disappears. Sometimes, a silhouette against the blood-red sunset. Sometimes closer. I feel its presence even when I cannot see it. A psychic weight that crushes my thoughts. The crew. There were 3 of us when we set out. I remember their faces, their laughter. Now I cannot recall their names. Were they ever real? Or are they just more constructs of this thing's terrible power? A chilling thought struck me. The earlier entries had been written in the first-person singular. I find a certain peace. My mind must be playing tricks. There had been no mention of a crew until this point. Was this a sign of the writer's fracturing sanity, inventing companions in their terror? Or had something happened to them? Something so horrific it was only now bleeding through the writer's mental defenses. November 15th. The whispers are constant now. They are not on the wind. They are in my head. They promise things. Release. Understanding. They say it is the guardian of a gate. A gate to other places. Other realities. They say it is ancient beyond reckoning. Older than the stars. They say it is lonely. Can something so vast, so powerful, be lonely? The thought is almost more terrifying than its hunger. The concept of a lonely, cosmic entity was a new, unsettling dimension to the horror. It painted a picture not just of a monster, but of a sentient being with motivations, however alien and incomprehensible. November 16th. I found something today. Adrift. A small, wooden crate, sealed with tar. It must have come from another vessel, lost long ago. Inside charts, but not of any ocean I know. They depict coastlines that twist in impossible geometries. Stars in unfamiliar constellations. And in the center of one chart, a symbol, a spiral with too many turns, coiling inwards to a point of utter blackness. The writer had attempted to sketch the symbol. It was a crude, shaky drawing. But there was a hypnotic quality to it, a sense of an infinitely receding depth that made my eyes ache to look at it for too long. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to replicate it, to trace its unsettling curves on a notepad I used for my own fieldwork. I resisted, a cold knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. The whispers say the chart is a key, They say the island, the impossible island I saw, it is not always there. It shifts. It moves between the folds of what we perceive as reality. They say the symbol will guide me. Guide me to what? To it. To the gate. Or to madness. The entries were becoming shorter, more fragmented. The writer's battle to maintain coherence was evident. November 18th. Food is low. Water nearly gone. It doesn't matter. The hunger I feel is not for earthly sustenance. I see it even when I close my eyes. Its form imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. The eyes, always the eyes. They know. They understand. Perhaps it is not an enemy. Perhaps it is salvation. A way out of this small, fragile existence. This shift in the writer's perception, this dawning, horrific acceptance, was perhaps the most disturbing development yet. The terror was being replaced by a kind of insane reverence. It was the psychological equivalent of a drowning. Man ceasing to struggle, surrendering to the abyss. The final entry in this section of the journal was barely a few lines, the handwriting so deteriorated, it was almost indecipherable. November 19th. The island. I see it. The spiral, it calls to me. I must go. It is waiting. It is beautiful. After that, several pages were stuck together, fused by salt and time. The ink on them was a complete blur. I tried to gently separate them, but the paper was too fragile, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Whatever horrors or revelations lay on those were, for now, lost to me. I sat back, the cabin oppressively silent save for the distant cry of a gull and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The sun was higher now, streaming through the window, yet the cabin felt cold, shadowed. The journal had taken me on a journey into a mind unraveling, into a cosmos teeming with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. My scientific skepticism was not just eroded, it was shattered, replaced by a nascent, terrifying belief. The world outside, the world of observable phenomena and rational explanations, suddenly felt like a thin veneer, a fragile illusion stretched precariously over an abyss of unimaginable horrors. The question was no longer whether the journal was a work of fiction or a madman's ravings. The question, the one that now burned in my mind with an intensity that bordered on obsession, was what lay on those fused pages. And, more terrifyingly, had the writer reached their beautiful island, and what had they found there? I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my sabbatical was over. My research had taken an unforeseen, terrifying new direction. The journal was no longer just an object of curiosity. It was a map, and I felt an undeniable, dreadful compulsion to follow it, regardless of where it might lead. The remainder of my sabbatical was consumed by the journal. It no longer lay on the table. I had sealed it within a specimen bag, as if that could somehow contain its insidious influence. It was a futile gesture. The journal's contents had embedded themselves in my psyche, twisting my dreams into nightmarish dioramas of black, churning seas and eyes that stared from abyssal depths. The solitude I had once sought was now a fragile thing, threatened by a knowledge I desperately wished I had never unearthed. My attempts to return to my routine fieldwork were fruitless. The small marine organisms I had studied with such dedication now seemed insignificant. Trivial details in a world far vaster and more terrifying than I had ever conceived. The scientist in me warred with a rising dread, scrabbling for rational explanations for the journalist's tale. A hallucinogenic mold, perhaps, thriving in the damp confines of a decaying vessel, or a severe psychotic episode triggered by profound isolation. Yet, no matter how I reasoned, I could not shake the chilling conviction in the writer's words. The spiral symbol, the one the journalist had sketched before the entries became indecipherable, haunted me. I found myself doodling it compulsively in the margins of my field notebooks, its tortuous curves seeming to draw the eye inward, creating a faint sense of vertigo, as if peering into a bottomless chasm. It was a symbol that appeared in no maritime or archaeological lexicon I knew. It felt unnervingly ancient and palpably malevolent. The decision, when it came, was not a moment of dramatic revelation, but a slow surrender to a gnawing obsession. I could not simply walk away. I could not return to my ordinary academic life with this mystery hanging over me, unresolved. The journal was no longer just a piece of flotsam. It had become a key, a challenge to the very reality I had always accepted without question. I cut my sabbatical short, citing ill health to the university, a reason not far from the truth. The psychological toll of the journal was beginning to manifest physically. I was thinner, my eyes were shadowed, and a constant, low-level paranoia had become my companion. My colleagues, I'm sure, noticed the change, but I dared not confide the true reason. They would think me mad. Perhaps I was. My first act upon returning to my university office, a sanctuary of books and marine specimens, was to attempt the separation of the journal's fused pages. I worked with meticulous care, employing tools normally reserved for the most delicate dissections. The process was painstaking, lasting hours, each slowly revealed surface causing my heart to thrum with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Unfortunately, the salt water had done its work too well. Only fragmented words and phrases remained legible. O architecture not of this earth, a song that bends the mind. They do not die. And, most chillingly, a crude sketch of what appeared to be a section of the island the journal writer had described: a black, unnaturally twisted spire, monolithic and malevolent, soaring into a dark, roiling sky. Even as a rough drawing, it conveyed a sense of terrifying scale and antiquity. My next focus was the chart the writer claimed to have found in the drifting crate. I scrutinized the details of the spiral symbol again, the descriptions of unfamiliar constellations and warped coastlines. As a marine biologist, I had a working knowledge of ocean currents and drift patterns. I began feeding the data from the journal the writer's last known approximate position, F, before their communication ceased, descriptions of the violent weather. However, and the estimated time the journal might been adrift into sophisticated computer models. The results were both startling and deeply unsettling. The models pointed to a remote region of the South Pacific, an area notorious for unpredictable storms and a long history of mysterious maritime disappearances. It was a patch of ocean rarely traversed by commercial shipping lanes and largely unexplored by scientific expeditions. Current nautical charts showed only open ocean, no islands, no reefs, nothing to indicate any anomaly. Yet, when I overlaid the journal's sketch of the warped coastline onto satellite imagery of the region, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. On certain high-resolution satellite passes, taken during rare windows of clear weather, there was a faintness, a submerged shadow, its shape inconsistent with known undersea geology. It was ephemeral, indistinct, yet chillingly reminiscent of the distorted outlines in the journal's drawing. As if the island existed, but predominantly beneath the waves. Or perhaps, as the journal suggested, it appeared and disappeared. I began researching the myths and folklore of the island chains closest to the indicated region. In archaic oral traditions, passed down through generations, there were mentions of phantom islands or moving islands that would appear to unfortunate mariners only to lead them to ruin or madness. These tales often spoke of alluring songs or whispers, and of terrible beings that inhabited these ephemeral lands. Academics had largely dismissed these as mere legends, but with the journal in my hands, they took on the grim resonance of warnings. I made discreet inquiries with a colleague, Dr. Amelia Van Horn, a marine geologist specializing in unusual bathymetric features. I didn't reveal the journal, merely asked about the possibility of unmapped, significant undersea structures in that particular region. She was skeptical, but conceded that the ocean still held vast mysteries, and new discoveries were always possible. She even mentioned some anomalous seismic readings from that area years ago, dismissed at the time as inconclusive. Each piece of evidence, however, slight and circumstantial on its own, began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, a terrifying pattern that pointed to the possibility that the journal writer's account was not mere fantasy. The obsession to find out was becoming all-consuming. I knew that what I was contemplating was beyond the pale of accepted science. It was a step into the territory of the deranged, an expedition to find an island that might not exist, to confront what could very well be a figment of a tortured mind. Nevertheless, I began to make preparations. I researched routes, chartered a small but robust sea-worthy vessel, and gathered supplies and scientific equipment, some necessary, some merely for a sense of preparedness. I told myself it was simply an unusually challenging field expedition, a chance to investigate an intriguing geological anomaly. But deep down, I knew what I was doing. I was heeding the journal writer's final, unspoken plea. I was going to search for what they had found. As my preparations neared completion, I read the journal one last time. The writer's words seemed to echo in my quiet office, no longer as a narrative, but as a prophecy. Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. I didn't know what door I was about to open, or what depths I was about to plumb. But I knew I could no longer turn back. The journal had bound my fate to that of its author, and whatever awaited me at that impossible island, I had to see it through. My own voyage was just beginning, and a new, colder wave of dread began to wash over me, a fear of what I might find, and what, in turn, might find me. The voyage to the coordinates, pinpointed by my research and the journal's fragmented clues, was an ordeal in itself. The chartered vessel, the Sea Serpent, was sturdy, as promised. But the ocean in this remote stretch of the Pacific was a capricious beast. Days of unnerving, glassy calm would suddenly give way to violent squalls that tossed the boat about like a child's toy. My crew, a pair of taciturn, weathered islanders named Kai and Manu, were skilled sailors, their faces betraying little emotion, even as mountainous waves crashed over the bow. They knew these waters, or at least the edges of them. When I had shown them the charts, my conventional nautical charts, not the unsettling ones from the journal, and indicated our destination, a flicker of something unreadable had passed between them. They asked no questions, a silence I found more unnerving than any protest. As we drew closer to the target area, a peculiar sense of anticipation settled over the Sea Serpent. The air grew heavy, humid, and an unnatural stillness fell upon the water. The usual cacophony of seabirds dwindled, then ceased altogether. Even Kai and Manu seemed affected, their usual quiet, watchfulness tinged with a new tension. The electronic navigation systems began to behave erratically, the GPS flickering, the depth sounder returning impossible reading. Ings or none at all. We were forced to rely on older method sextant, compass, and dead reckoning, skills I was thankful I maintained from my earlier fieldwork. It was on the 5th day in the target zone, under a bruised, purple sky that threatened a storm yet held its breath, that Manu, his voice a low rumble, pointed to the horizon. Land, he said, though the word seemed inadequate. It was not land as I knew it. Rising from the steely gray water was a series of black, needle-like spires, their surfaces slick and non-reflective, like obsidian or wet basalt. They were grotesquely twisted, defying geological norms, piercing the sky at unnatural angles. There was no sign of vegetation, no sandy beaches, only these stark, menacing monoliths. And at their center, veiled in a shimmering heat like haze, was a larger, more massive structure, the spire from the journal's crude sketch. Though the drawing had done no justice to its horrifying scale and alien geometry, it seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly, greenish, yellow glow that was profoundly unsettling. As we navigated cautiously closer, a low, throbbing hum began to permeate the air, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It resonated with the hull of the Sea Serpent, setting my teeth on edge. This, I realized with a jolt of icy dread, must be the journal writer had mentioned, a vibration that didn't just bend the mind, but seemed to warp the very fabric of perception. Strange, fleeting images flickered at the periphery of my vision, impossible colors, shifting landscapes, faces that were almost human, but hideously distorted. I fought to maintain my composure, my scientific objectivity, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands. Kai and Manu were visibly distressed now. Their dark skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and they muttered to each other in their native tongue. Words I could not understand, but whose fearful cadence was unmistakable. I ordered them to anchor a safe distance from the island, if island was the correct term for this nightmarish outcrop. I would proceed alone in the ship's small inflatable dinghy. They did not argue, their relief palpable. The water around the island was unnaturally dark, almost black, and disturbingly placid, despite the low hum that vibrated through it. As I rowed closer, the air grew colder, imbued with the same ancient, briny, and unsettlingly organic scent that had clung to the journal. The spires loomed over me, their scale dwarfing my small craft. The silence, save for the thrumming and the dip of my oars, was absolute and terrifying. I found a small, narrow inlet between two of the smaller spires, a dark chasm that seemed to lead into the island's interior. The water here was shallow, revealing a seabed not of sand or rock, but of something that looked disturbingly like compacted, fossilized organic matter, patterned with the same unsettling spiral motif I had seen in the journal. My hand, gripping the oar, trembled uncontrollably. Securing the dinghy, I stepped onto the shore. The ground beneath my boots was strangely resilient, like hardened rubber, and it too bore the faint, spiral patterns. The air was thick, difficult to breathe, and the thrumming intensified, now accompanied by faint, sibilant whispers that seemed to slither around the edges of my hearing. They were not in any language I recognized, yet they conveyed a sense of immense age, of vast, alien intellect, and of a profound, chilling hunger. I had brought a small kit with me, a flashlight, a geological hammer, sample bags, my camera, and, tucked into my belt, a heavy flare gun, a flimsy defense. I knew, against whatever horrors this place might hold, but a small comfort nonetheless. The passage wound inwards, away from the oppressive light of the bruised sky, into a gloom that my flashlight beam struggled to penetrate. The walls of the passage were not rock in any conventional sense. They were a dark, veined material, slightly yielding to the touch, like hardened cartilage. And embedded within them, at irregular intervals, were things. At first, I thought they were unusually shaped mineral concretions. But as I drew closer, flashlight beam wavering, I saw they were organic. Or at least they had once been. They were creatures, or parts of creatures, encased in the island's substance, their forms twisted into expressions of unimaginable agony or ecstasy. Some were vaguely piscine, others disturbingly arthropodal, and some were unclassifiable, nightmarish amalgams of limbs, eyes, and orifices that defied any biological precedent. They were not fossils in the traditional sense. They seemed to be absorbed, incorporated into the very being of the island. They do not die, the journal fragment had whispered. My stomach churned. The scientific curiosity that had driven me this far was being rapidly overwhelmed by a primal, visceral terror. I took photographs, my hands shaking so badly the images would likely be blurred. I chipped off a small sample of the wall with my hammer. It came away with a wet, tearing sound, and the freshly exposed surface beneath seemed to glisten, almost to breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, coiling around my thoughts, promising knowledge, power, an end to the insignificant anxieties of human existence. They spoke of the gate, of the old ones who slept beyond it, and of the guardian that kept watch, the entity the journal writer had seen, the mountainous flesh and eye, thing that was the island itself or its master. I pressed on, driven by a compulsion that was no longer my own. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber, dimly illuminated by the same sickly greenish, yellow light that emanated from the central spire, which I could now see towered above, its peak lost in the oppressive darkness of the cavern roof. And in the center of the chamber, on a raised dais of the same spiraled, organic material, lay the source of the light. It was not a geological feature. It was an egg, or something akin to an egg. It was immense, easily the size of a small house, ovoid and translucent, its surface veined with pulsating, dark arteries. And within it, suspended in a luminous, amniotic fluid, was a shape. A fetal, colossal form curled upon itself. I could see a multitude of nascent limbs, the suggestion of forming eyes, countless and lidless, and a vast, slowly beating heart that was the source of the thrumming that filled the air in my mind. It was gestating. The guardian, or perhaps a sign of it, was being born, or reborn. The whispers reached a crescendo, no longer seductive, but demanding, exultant. They urged me forward, to touch the egg, to become part of the glorious, terrible process. My sanity was a frayed thread. I could feel my will dissolving, my identity being subsumed by the overwhelming, psychic presence of this place, this entity. It was then, as I took a stumbling step forward, that my foot struck something. I looked down. It was a skeleton, human, clad in the tattered remnants of what looked like an old-fashioned oilskin coat. And clutched in its bony fingers was a small, leather-bound, water-stained journal. The shock of recognition, so potent, so absolute, was like a physical blow. It was him, the writer. He had reached his beautiful island. He had come to this very chamber, and he had become another offering, another absorbed piece of the island's horrific tapestry. That realization, the stark, undeniable fate of my predecessor, was what saved me. It shattered the psychic hold, the horrifying allure. Revulsion and a desperate, animalistic need to survive surged through me. I turned and fled. I didn't look back at the pulsating egg, at the whispers that now shrieked with fury and frustration. I scrambled through the dark passage, past the entombed horrors in the walls, their silent screams echoing in my mind. I burst out into the bruised daylight, the thrumming of the island a physical pressure at my back. I threw myself into the dinghy, rowing with a strength born of sheer terror, not caring about the direction, only needing to put distance between myself and that abomination. The sea serpent, Kai, and Manu were a beacon of blessed normality in a world that had tilted on its axis. As they hauled me aboard, as we turned the ship and fled that accursed place, I risked one last look back. The shimmering haze around the central spire seemed to intensify, and for a horrifying instant, I thought I saw it move. A colossal shifting, as if something immense was stirring within or beneath. And from the peak of the spire, a single, vast, leadless eye, glowing with that same sickly green light, seemed to open and fix its gaze upon our fleeing vessel. I didn't sleep for days. The nightmares, when exhaustion finally claimed me, are beyond description. What I read in that journal will indeed give me nightmares for the rest of my life. But what I saw, what I experienced on that island, that has scarred something deeper than my mind. It has scarred my soul. I have the samples. I have the photographs, blurred as they are. I even have the second journal, its pages even more ravaged by time and the elements than the first. I am a scientist. I should analyze them, publish my findings, warn the world. But how can I? Who would believe me? And more importantly, do I dare draw the attention of that thing to our world again? Some doors are best left unopened. Some depths are best left unplumbed. I know that now. I know it with a certainty that chills me to the very marrow of my bones. And I know that somewhere, in the remote vastness of the South Pacific, an island of impossible geometry and unspeakable horror waits, and an ancient, malevolent intelligence slumbers, gestates, and perhaps watches. My name is Arthur Finchley, and I have always considered myself a man of logic, a purveyor of facts over fancy. By profession, I am an archivist, specializing in the preservation and study of historical documents. It is a career that rewards meticulous observation and a skeptical mind, traits I have cultivated assiduously over my 47 years. My work rarely takes me beyond the hallowed, dust-filled halls of the institutions I serve, but an unusual assignment had recently presented itself. The acquisition and authentication of a series of letters, purported to be from a rather obscure 19th century industrialist, currently housed in a private collection in a remote part of the country. The most sensible, indeed the only practical, way to reach the estate was via the Night Watchman Express, an old, privately run sleeper train service that still traversed some of the lesser used lines, a relic of a bygone era. The prospect of an overnight train journey was not, in itself, unappealing. I have a certain fondness for the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, the gentle sway that can lull one into a state of contemplative calm. This particular service, however, was shrouded in a peculiar sort of local mystique. Scant information was available online, and the booking process itself had been an exercise in anachronistic communication, involving a series of polite but terse telephone calls and a ticket dispatched by registered post. The station from which the Night Watchman Express departed was not one of the city's grand, bustling terminals. Instead, it was a small, almost forgotten, outpost on the industrial fringe, its Victorian architecture grimed with the soot of decades, its gas lamps casting a flickering, uncertain light as dusk began to settle. There were few other passengers in evidence, a handful of solitary figures who seemed to melt into the shadows, their faces obscured, their demeanor subdued. The air was heavy, with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and faintly unsettling, like old blood or rusting iron. The train itself was a magnificent, if somewhat imposing, sight. Its carriages were of an older, heavier design, painted a deep, almost black crimson, with gold lettering spelling out Night Watchman Express in an ornate, slightly faded script. It looked less like a mode of public transport and more like a private conveyance from a Gothic novel. A uniformed attendant, his face pale and impassive, stood by the entrance to my designated carriage. He checked my ticket with a curt nod, his eyes dark and deep set, lingering on me for a moment longer than was comfortable. My compartment was at the far end of the carriage. It was surprisingly spacious, paneled in dark, polished wood, with a single berth, a small wash basin, and a window that looked out onto the rapidly darkening platform. An old-fashioned, tasseled lamp cast a warm, amber glow over the interior. It was all rather charmingly antiquated, and I felt a small measure of my earlier unease begin to dissipate. It was only after the train had lurched into motion, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels a familiar comfort, that I noticed the small, cream-colored card tucked into the frame of the mirror above the wash basin. It was printed in a simple, clear typeface. Under the heading, Arguios, San Seftyyofour Passangiars. I picked it up, expecting the usual banal instructions regarding smoking or luggage storage. What I read, however, caused a frown to crease my brow. The rules were as follows. 1. Upon retiring for the night, ensure your compartment door is locked from the inside. Do not open it for any reason until the first light of dawn, regardless of what you may hear. 2. Should you experience a sensation of unusual coldness or a persistent metallic scent, remain in your berth and do not look out of the window. The dining car service concludes at 10:00 p.m. No member of staff will approach your compartment offering refreshment after this time. Politely decline any such offers. 4. If you observe another passenger behaving in a distressed or erratic manner, do not engage. Alert the conductor at your earliest, discreet opportunity. 5. Personal items of reflective nature, mirrors, polished silver, etc., should be covered or stowed away after nightfall. 6. Should the train make an unscheduled stop in an unlit area, remain in your compartment with the blinds drawn. Do not attempt to ascertain the reason for the stop. 7. Whispering is to be avoided in the corridors after midnight. Sounds carry in peculiar ways on this line. 8. If you awaken to find a small, dark stain on your pillow or bed linen that was not there previously, do not touch it. Report it to the attendant upon disembarking. I read the list twice, a growing sense of incredulity mixing with a nascent disquiet. This was not the standard fare of railway regulations. It read more like a set of bizarre instructions for navigating a haunted house. My logical mind immediately sought rational explanations. Perhaps this was an elaborate prank, a piece of local folklore designed to amuse or unnerve tourists. Or maybe it was a poorly translated set of guidelines from another language, resulting in these odd pronouncements. Yet, the card was printed on good quality stock, the language precise and unambiguous. There was a seriousness to it that belied the notion of a simple joke. I recalled the attendant's unblinking stare, the somber atmosphere of the station. Preposterous, I muttered to myself, though a sliver of unease had lodged itself in my thoughts. I decided a walk to the dining car was in order. Perhaps a stiff drink to dispel this foolishness. The corridor outside my compartment was dimly lit, the ornate sconces casting long, dancing shadows. The plush carpet muffled my footsteps, creating an almost unnerving silence, broken only by the rhythmic sway and clatter of the train. I passed several other compartment doors, all closed. No sound emanating from within. It felt as though I were the only soul awake on this moving mausoleum. The dining car was a study in faded grandeur. Velvet curtains, heavy and wine-colored, framed the windows. Tables were laid with white linen, and surprisingly good quality silverware, which I noted with a wry internal smile, remembering Rule 5. Only 2 other tables were occupied. At one, a solitary elderly woman with a severe expression stared blankly out at the passing darkness. At another, a young couple sat in silence, picking at their food with a distinct lack of appetite, their faces pale. I ordered a brandy, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the strange chill that had begun to settle over me. The waiter, a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to absorb the light, served me with a silent efficiency that was more unnerving than reassuring. I tried to engage him in conversation, to ask about the regulations, but he merely offered a thin, almost imperceptible smile and retreated to the galley. Returning to my compartment, the list of rules seemed to loom larger in my mind. Rule 1: do not open it for any reason until the first light of dawn, regardless of what you may hear. What could one possibly hear that would tempt one to open the door against such a stern warning? As the hour grew later, the train seemed to pick up speed, hurtling through the inky blackness of the countryside. The rhythmic clatter became more insistent, the swaying more pronounced. I prepared for bed, meticulously checking the lock on my door. A heavy brass bolt that slid into place with a satisfying thud. I then drew the thick blinds over the window, though I hesitated for a moment, a strange compulsion urging me to look out. I resisted, remembering Rule 20. Do not look out of the window. I lay in my berth, the sounds of the train filling the silence. The gentle rocking, usually soporific, now seemed to carry a subtle undercurrent of menace. My mind kept replaying the list of rules, each one more unsettling than the last. A persistent metallic scent. No member of staff will approach. Personal items of a reflective nature. An unscheduled stop. Whispering. A small, dark stain. It must have been well after midnight when I was jolted from a light doze by a sound from the corridor. It was a soft, dragging noise, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimpering. My heart hammered against my ribs. I strained my ears, listening intently. The dragging sound seemed to be moving slowly past my door. Then, a soft scratching, like fingernails drawn lightly across the wood. Rule 1: do not open it for any reason, regardless of what you may hear. The logical part of my brain screamed that was probably just another passenger, perhaps unwell, or a member of staff going about their duties. But the sheer, unadulterated terror that gripped me was anything but logical. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, followed by a low, guttural moan that did not sound entirely human. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing passage just outside my sealed compartment. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, they faded into the distance, swallowed by the relentless rhythm of the train. Sleep, I knew, would be impossible now. Every nerve in my body was alight. Every shadow in the compartment seemed to wreathe with unseen threats. I found myself staring at the small, brass wash basin, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light from under the door. Rule 5. Personal items of a reflective nature should be covered or stowed away after nightfall. With trembling hands, I reached for the small towel and draped it over the basin, obscuring its reflective surface. It was a small, perhaps irrational, act, but it brought a sliver of comfort in the oppressive darkness. The hours crawled by, each tick of my pocket watch amplified in the silence. The train continued its relentless journey through the night, a steel serpent rushing through a sleeping world. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that not everything on this train was asleep. And the rules, which I had initially dismissed as an eccentric folly, now felt like the only fragile barrier between myself and whatever horrors the Night Watchman Express held within its crimson carriages. The first light of dawn, I realized, could not come soon enough. The remainder of the night passed in a state of heightened, agonizing awareness. Every creak of the carriage, every distant rumble of the wheels, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. I did not dare to close my eyes for more than a few moments at a time, convinced that some unseen horror lurked just beyond the thin veneer of my compartment door, or perhaps even within the shadows of the room itself. The image of the small, cream-colored card and its cryptic rules remained seared into my mind. As the first, faint gray light of pre-dawn began to seep through the edges of the window blinds, a profound, if wary, sense of relief washed over me. I had survived the night, or at least, the darkest hours of it. Rule 1 had stated, "Do not open it for any reason until the first light of dawn." Dawn was now breaking, albeit reluctantly. With cautious, deliberate movements, I rose from my berth. My limbs were stiff, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The air in the compartment felt stale and heavy, still carrying that faint, unsettling metallic tang I had noticed earlier, the very scent mentioned in Rule 2. I made a mental note of it, the archivist in me cataloging the peculiarity even as my nerves frayed. I approached the door, my hand hesitating over the brass bolt. The sounds from the corridor, the dragging, the scratching, the inhuman moans had long since ceased, but their memory was vivid and disturbing. Taking a deep breath, I slid the bolt back. The click echoed loudly in the confined space. Peering out into the corridor, I found it empty. The dim sconces still cast their flickering light, but the oppressive atmosphere of the night seemed to have lessened somewhat with the approaching day. There was no sign of what might have caused the disturbances. The plush carpet lay undisturbed. No marks, no stains. Nothing to indicate the terrifying passage I had witnessed. My first instinct was to find the conductor, to report what I had heard, perhaps even to demand an explanation for the bizarre set of regulations. But then Rule 4 came to mind. If you observe another passenger behaving in a distressed or erratic manner, do not engage. Alert the conductor at your earliest discreet opportunity. While I hadn't seen another passenger, the sounds were certainly indicative of distress, if not something far worse, and the rules themselves implied that direct confrontation was not advisable. I decided to wait, to observe. Perhaps the light of day would bring clarity, or at least other passengers with whom I could confer. I performed my morning ablutions, carefully avoiding looking too closely at my own reflection in the now uncovered wash basin mirror, a lingering effect of Rule 5. My own face looked back at me, pale and drawn. The eyes of a man who had not slept, but had instead stared into some nameless dread. A soft chime echoed through the carriage, followed by a crackling announcement over an unseen intercom system. The voice was clipped and devoid of emotion. Breakfast is now being served in the dining car. The Night Watchman Express will be arriving at its final destination, Ashworth Terminus, at approximately 8:15 a.m. The thought of food was not particularly appealing, but the prospect of seeing other people, of escaping the claustrophobic confines of my compartment, was. I made my way back to the dining car. It was more populated than it had been the previous evening. The elderly woman with the severe expression was there again, nursing a cup of tea, her gaze still fixed on some distant, unseen point. The young couple also sat at their table, though they looked even more haggard than before, dark circles under their eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally casting furtive glances around the car. Several other passengers were present now. A portly businessman engrossed in a newspaper, a woman in traveling tweeds sketching in a notebook, and a man with a heavily bandaged hand, who seemed to be in some discomfort. I took a seat at an empty table, and the same gaunt waiter from the previous night approached. He placed a menu before me without a word. I ordered coffee and toast, my appetite still minimal. "Excuse me," I began, attempting to keep my voice even, "about those regulations in the compartments." The waiter paused, his eyes, like chips of obsidian, meeting mine. For a moment, I thought he might respond, but then that same thin, unsettling smile touched his lips. He inclined his head slightly and moved away without a word, leaving my question hanging in the air. Frustration mingled with my unease. It was clear that the staff were not going to be forthcoming. I glanced towards the young couple. They had stopped their hushed conversation and were now looking directly at me, an expression of shared anxiety on their faces. The woman, who couldn't have been much older than 25, had wide, frightened eyes. As the waiter moved out of earshot, the young man leaned forward slightly. "You saw the rules too, then?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A direct contravention of Rule 7, though it was not yet past midnight, of course. I nodded. Indeed. And I heard certain things in the corridor last night. A look of profound fear crossed the woman's face. The scratching, she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her husband's arm, and the moaning. Yes, I confirmed, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Precisely that. We heard it too, the man said, his voice strained. We locked our door. Just like the card said. It went on for ages. We thought whatever it was would try to get in. Did you see anything? I asked. They both shook their heads. We didn't dare look. The woman replied, her voice trembling. Rule 1 and Rule 2. About not looking out the window if you feel a coldness. Our compartment became freezing just before the sound started. A chill traced its way down my own spine. My compartment hadn't become noticeably colder, but the metallic scent had been undeniable. It seemed the phenomena were not uniform, or perhaps different rules were triggered by different entities. And the stain? I asked, remembering Rule 8. Did either of you notice anything like that? They exchanged a horrified glance. No, the man said a little too quickly. Nothing at all. But his eyes darted nervously towards his wife, and I had the distinct impression he was not being entirely truthful. Before I could press further, the portly businessman at a nearby table cleared his throat loudly. One really shouldn't discuss such morbid fancies, he said. His voice pompous, though his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. It's merely the company's way of adding a bit of theatricality to the journey. Old train, old stories. You understand. He rustled his newspaper pointedly, clearly indicating the conversation was over. The young couple shrank back, and I was left to ponder his words. Was it possible? Could this all be an elaborate, albeit unsettling, piece of theater? The attendant's demeanor, the waiter's silence. The rules themselves, could they be part of a carefully constructed performance? My logical mind wanted to believe it, to grasp at this rational explanation. Yet, the genuine fear I had witnessed in the young couple, the visceral terror I myself had experienced during the night, felt far too real to be dismissed so easily. And the metallic scent, the coldness they described, these were physical sensations, not mere suggestions. The train began to slow, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels decreasing. Outside, the gray light had strengthened, revealing a landscape of rolling hills shrouded in mist. We were approaching Ashworth Terminus. As passengers began to gather their belongings, I noticed the man with the bandaged hand. He was pale and sweating, despite the coolness of the morning. His eyes darted around nervously, and he seemed to be avoiding contact with anyone. I recalled Rule. If you observe another passenger behaving in a distressed or erratic manner, do not engage. Alert the conductor at your earliest, discreet opportunity. His distress was palpable. The train glided into the station, a small, rural stop that looked as though it hadn't changed much in 100 years. The platform was almost deserted. As I disembarked, I looked for the conductor, intending to mention the man with the bandaged hand, and, perhaps, if I dared, to ask about the rules one last time. The same impassive attendant, who had greeted me the previous evening, stood by the carriage door, his face a mask. "Excuse me," I said. "The conductor." He gestured with his head towards a small, official-looking building at the end of the platform. "Office." I thanked him and made my way towards it. As I did, I saw the man, with the bandaged, hurry off the train, clutching his injured limb, and disappear quickly down a side street. Without a backward glance, he seemed desperate to get away. The conductor's office was small and sparsely furnished. A man in a slightly more ornate uniform than the attendant sat behind a large wooden desk, poring over a ledger. He looked up as I entered, his expression neutral. "Mr. Finchley?" he asked, before I had even spoken. I was taken aback. "Yes." "How did you know?" "We have a limited passenger list on the night watchman, sir. And you are the only one scheduled to disembark who has not, yet, checked out, so to speak." His smile was as thin and unreadable as the waiter's. "I see," I said, feeling a renewed sense of unease. "I wish to report something." A passenger, a man with a bandaged hand, seemed quite distressed. The conductor nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, Mr. Henderson. An unfortunate accident with some luggage, I believe. He is being attended to." His response was too smooth, too rehearsed. I didn't believe him. "And the rules?" I pressed. "The regulations in the compartments. What is their purpose?" The conductor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The Night Watchman Express is a very old service, Mr. Finchley. It operates on lines that have seen a great deal of history. The rules are simply precautions for the comfort and safety of our passengers." He enunciated the last words with a peculiar emphasis, the same phrase that headed the card. "Precautions against what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He held my gaze for a long moment, his eyes unblinking. "Against the discomforts of the night, Mr. Finchley. Some journeys are more taxing than others. We trust yours was uneventful." The implication was clear. He knew. He knew what transpired on his train, and he was not going to elaborate. Defeated, I merely nodded. "Yes, uneventful. Excellent," he said, his smile widening fractionally. "We trust you will consider the Night Watchman Press for your future travel needs." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. As I left the station and stepped out into the cool morning air of Ashworth, I felt as though I had surfaced from some deep, dark water. The mundane reality of the small town, with its bakery smells and distant church bells, was a stark contrast to the oppressive, rule-bound world of the train. My assignment was a few miles distant. I resolved to hire a car, to put as much distance between myself and that cursed railway line as possible. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the rules of the Night Watchman Express, and the horrors they hinted at, would haunt my thoughts for a long time to come. And a small, nagging part of me wondered about Rule 8, the dark stain. Had the young couple truly not seen one? Or had they simply been too afraid to admit it? The journey was over, but the unease lingered, a metallic taste in the back of my throat. My business in Ashworth, the authentication of the aforementioned 19th century letters, should have been a straightforward affair. The collection was housed in a rather dilapidated manor house a few miles from the town, owned by a reclusive descendant of the industrialist. Under normal circumstances, I would have approached the task with my usual professional detachment and intellectual curiosity. However, the shadow of the night watchman express loomed large. Its unsettling rules and the pervasive sense of dread I had experienced aboard it tainting my every thought. I hired a motor car. As planned, a sturdy but unremarkable vehicle, and the drive through the mist-laden countryside did little to dispel my unease. Every shadowed copse of trees, every isolated farmhouse, seemed to hold a whisper of the same unknown menace that had permeated the train. The metallic scent, though fainter now, still seemed to cling to the back of my throat, a phantom reminder of Rule 2. The manor house, when I finally reached it, was a Gothic pile that looked as though it had sprung directly from the pages of one of Mrs. Radcliffe's less cheerful novels. Its owner, a Mr. Silas Blackwood, was as eccentric as his dwelling, a gaunt, elderly man with eyes that seemed to hold a deep, wary knowledge of things best left unspoken. He greeted me with a dry, rustling voice and led me to a cavernous library, where the letters were kept. Ordinarily, the sight of such a trove of historical documents would have filled me with a quiet excitement. But as I sat at a large oak desk, the precious papers spread before me, I found my concentration wavering. My mind kept drifting back to the train, the locked door, the scratching sounds, the conductor's knowing, yet uninformative smile. Rule 8, concerning the unexplained dark stain, gnawed at me. Had the young couple lied? Or had they simply been too terrified to acknowledge what they might have found? The image of the man with the bandaged hand, Mr. Henderson, also kept intruding his palpable fear, his hasty departure. What unfortunate accident with some luggage could elicit such a reaction and require such heavy bandaging? Mr. Blackwood, despite his initial reticence, proved to be a surprisingly astute observer. After several hours of my rather distracted attempts at authentication, during which I fear my scholarly rigor was somewhat lacking, he cleared his throat. "You seem troubled, Mr. Finchley," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Beyond the usual wariness of travel, I mean. You arrived on the night watchman, did you not?" I looked up, surprised. "Yes, I did. How did you surmise?" A faint, almost melancholic smile touched his lips. "Few arrive in Ashworth by that particular service anymore. And those who do often carry a certain atmosphere with them." He paused, his gaze distant. "It is an old line, Mr. Finchley. Very old. It runs through lands that have seen more than their share of sorrow and strangeness." His words, so reminiscent of the conductor's own veiled warnings, sent a fresh chill through me. Here was an educated man, a custodian of history, speaking of the train, not as a mere mode of transport, but as something imbued with a deeper, darker significance. "The regulations," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you familiar with them?" Mr. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Ah, yes. A necessary precaution, I am told. Though some say the rules are as much a part of their experience as the journey itself." Experience of what? Precisely. I pressed, emboldened by his willingness to discuss the matter, however obliquely. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and piercing, like those of an ancient bird. Some things, Mr. Finchley, are best left undisturbed. Some doors are best left unopened. The night watchman, it passes through places where the veil between worlds is thin. The rules are there to guide those who inadvertently stray too close to what lies beyond. His words, though steeped in what I would normally dismiss as superstitious folklore, resonated with the terror I had felt. The dragging, the moaning, these were not the sounds of the mundane world. The other passengers, I said, thinking of the young couple, of Mr. Henderson. Do they always follow the rules? Mr. Blackwood's smile faded. Not always. Curiosity is a powerful human trait, as is disbelief. Some find the temptation to look, to open the door, too strong to resist. The train, it has a way of testing its passengers. He gestured, vaguely, towards a bookshelf laden with ancient, leather-bound tomes. There are stories, local legends, of course, of passengers who did not heed the warnings, of those who vanished entirely between one station and the next, or those who disembarked, changed. The word hung in the air. I thought of Mr. Henderson's bandaged hand, his frantic escape. Had he broken a rule? Had he touched something he shouldn't have? Perhaps the dark stain of Rule 8 was not merely a stain, but a sign of contact, a mark left by something. I spent 2 days at Ashworth Manor, completing my work with a diligence born, more of a desire to escape than of professional zeal. Mr. Blackwood remained a cryptic, but not unkind host. He never elaborated further on the mysteries of the Night Watchman Express. But his earlier words had confirmed my deepest fears. The train was not merely a conveyance, but a conduit. And the rules were a fragile shield against an unnamed, unseen malevolence. The journey back to the city was, thankfully, by a different, more modern railway line, one that traveled in broad daylight and stopped at brightly lit, bustling stations. Yet, even amidst the reassuring normality of this return trip, I found myself glancing nervously at locked compartment doors, flinching at unexpected noises in the corridor. The experience on the Night Watchman had left an indelible mark. Upon my return, I attempted to research the Night Watchman Express. My archival skills, usually so effective, yielded frustratingly little. There were no official company records, beyond the most basic registration. Mentions in old newspapers were scant and uninformative. It was as if the train operated in a reality all its own, shielded from public scrutiny. I found a few obscure local history forums online where whispers and anecdotal accounts could be found, tales of strange lights seen from the train, of passengers who reported lost time, of an unnerving coldness that settled in certain carriages. But these were dismissed by most as urban legends, the fanciful imaginings of an overactive mind. I knew better. I had felt the cold, smelled the metallic tang, heard the scratching at my door. Weeks turned into months. The sharp edges of the terror began to dull, but the unease remained, a low hum beneath the surface of my daily life. I found myself more prone to introspection, less certain of the solid, logical world I had always inhabited. Sleep was often disturbed by fragmented dreams of dark corridors, locked doors, and the rhythmic, relentless clatter of unseen wheels. One evening, sorting through a box of uncatalogued ephemera in the archives, a task I usually found soothing, I came across a small, faded photograph. It depicted a group of railway workers from the late Victorian era, standing proudly in front of a steam locomotive. The engine bore no name, but its design was heavy, archaic. It was the faces of the men that caught my attention. They were pale, their expressions uniformly grim, their eyes holding a haunted, watchful quality. And the attendant who had checked my ticket of the Night Watchman Express, or a man who could have been his identical ancestor, stood amongst them, his face unchanged by the intervening decades. My blood ran cold. I dropped the photograph as if it had burned my fingers. This was no coincidence. The staff of the Night Watchman, like the train itself, seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The rules, I now understood, were not just for a single journey. They were a timeless pact, a set of commandments for navigating a realm that bordered our own, a realm that the Night Watchman Express, for reasons unknown, traversed with unnerving regularity. And I, Arthur Finchley, man of logic and reason, had been a passenger. I had followed the rules mostly. But the question that continued to plague me, the one that surfaced in the darkest hours of the night, was what fate befell those who did not. And was the metallic taste that sometimes still lingered in my mouth merely a memory, or a sign that some part of that other realm had, despite my caution, latched onto me? The final rule, Rule 8, about the dark stain, remained the most enigmatic, the most personally terrifying. I had not seen one in my compartment, but the very idea that such a thing could manifest, a physical mark of some unholy visitation, was a horror that my rational mind struggled and failed to fully dismiss. The discovery of the photograph, with the attendant's ageless face staring out from a bygone century, was a turning point. It shattered the last vestiges of my skepticism. The comfortable illusion that my experience on the Night Watchman Express could be rationalized away as an elaborate hoax or a stress-induced hallucination. The train was real, its horrors were real, and its crew were seemingly untouched by the passage of time. Eternal servants of that damned line. My life, once a predictable and orderly affair, became increasingly consumed by an obsession with the Night Watchman. The archives, once my sanctuary, now felt like a hunting ground. I began to delve into the most obscure and forgotten corners of our collection, searching for any further mention, any scrap of information that might shed light on the train's origins or its true purpose. I cross-referenced old railway ledgers, local parish records from the areas the line traversed, and even delved into collections of folklore and occult literature, a pursuit I would have once scorned as utterly unscholarly. What I found was fragmented, veiled in allegory and superstition, but a pattern began to emerge. The railway line upon which the Night Watchman ran was indeed ancient, far older than the steam era. It followed a path that had been a ley line, a track used for centuries, perhaps millennia, for purposes unknown, pilgrimages, processions, or something far darker. Stories abounded of strange disappearances, of unsettling encounters, long before the first iron rails were laid. The train, it seemed, had merely inherited the malevolence of the land it crossed. There were whispers of a pact made by the original founders of the railway company, a desperate measure to ensure the line's probability through notoriously difficult and sparsely populated terrain. A pact with something. Something that demanded a certain toll, a periodic tribute, not of money, but of something less tangible, more vital. The rules, I began to suspect, were not just for the protection of passengers, but perhaps also a means of selecting or preparing this tribute. The metallic scent, the unnatural cold, the whispering, these were the markers of its presence, the thinning of the veil Mr. Blackwood had spoken of. And Rule 8, the dark stain. I found a particularly chilling account in a privately printed diary from the 1880s, written by a clergyman who had traveled the line. He described awakening to find such a mark on his pristine white collar, a small, viscous smear that seemed to absorb the light. He wrote of a profound spiritual sickness that overcame him afterwards, a draining of faith and vitality, as if some essential part of his soul had been leached. He died a few months later, a hollow shell of his former self. This discovery filled me with a cold dread. Had I narrowly escaped such a fate? Or was the lingering, metallic taste, the persistent unease, a sign that my own encounter had left a more subtle, insidious mark? I thought again of the other passengers. The young couple, had they found a stain and, in their terror, disposed of the evidence, or feigned ignorance? Their pale, haunted faces suggested a deeper trauma than mere fright. And Mr. Henderson, with his bandaged hand, what had he touched? What had touched him? Had he, in a moment of panic or defiance, broken Rule 8, and attempted to wipe away the stain, only to suffer a more direct physical consequence? The more I learned, the more I realized the Night Watchman Express was not just a train, but a mechanism, a carefully maintained system for interacting with, and perhaps appeasing, whatever entity claimed to that ancient track. The timeless attendants were its guardians, its priests, ensuring the smooth operation of this unholy compact. My research took a toll. I became withdrawn, my colleagues noting my haggard appearance and distracted demeanor. Sleep offered no respite, only a recurring nightmare. I am on the train, the corridor is endless, and every door I try is locked. The scratching sound is behind me, getting closer. I can smell the metallic tang, feel the unnatural cold. And I know, with a certainty that freezes my soul, that if I am caught, I will not merely die, but be changed, incorporated into the train's spectral crew, or offered up as sustenance. One evening, driven by a desperation I could no longer contain, I resolved to find the young couple. Their fear had been too genuine, their shared experience too similar to my own. If anyone could corroborate my growing understanding, or offer some solace, it was them. Their names, I recalled from a brief glance, at the passenger manifest the conductor had inadvertently left visible were Mr. and Mrs. Alastair Finch. A common enough name, but I had a starting point. It took weeks of discreet inquiries, leveraging my archival contacts and sifting through public records. But I eventually traced them to a small cottage in a quiet village, far from any railway line. It was with a heavy heart and a sense of impending revelation that I made the journey. The cottage was idyllic on the surface. Roses around the door, a neatly tended garden. But a palpable sense of sorrow hung in the air. Mrs. Finch answered the door. She was even paler and thinner than I remembered, her eyes holding a profound, inconsolable grief. When she recognized me, a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or a grim understanding crossed her face. She invited me in, her voice a mere whisper. The cottage was sparsely furnished, impeccably clean, but with an atmosphere of stillness, of a life put on hold. Mr. Finch was not there. Alastair, she began, her voice trembling. He hasn't been well since that journey. She explained, in halting, painful sentences, what had transpired after they disembarked. They had indeed found a small, dark stain on their bed linen. Alastair, a man of pragmatic and somewhat impatient temperament, had dismissed it as a spillage, an oil mark from the train. Against her pleas, he had touched it, tried to wipe it away with his handkerchief. From that day, he had begun to change. A creeping coldness entered him, a listlessness that no doctor could diagnose. He lost interest in his work, in food, in life itself. He would spend hours staring blankly, a faint metallic scent clinging to him. His hand, the one that had touched the stain, began to wither, the skin becoming dry and discolored, as if blighted from within. It was not a bandage he needed, but an amputation of the soul. He was now in a private sanatorium, his condition deteriorating daily. The doctors were baffled, speaking of rare neurological disorders, of psychosomatic illness. But Mrs. Finch knew, as I knew, that the cause was far more sinister. The rules. She whispered, tears streaming down her face. We should have understood. He should never have touched it. Her story confirmed my worst fears. Rule 8 was not a warning about hygiene. It was a commandment against direct contact with the mark of the entity, a mark that seemed to initiate a process of consumption, of spiritual decay. Mr. Henderson's bandaged hand was likely a similar, perhaps more aggressive, manifestation. There was little I could offer Mrs. Finch in the way of comfort. My knowledge was a burden, not a solace. I left the cottage with a heavier heart than ever, the full, horrifying implications of the night watchman express laid bare. I have not ridden a train since. I cannot. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, once a soothing sound, now evokes only a visceral terror. I continue my work in the archives, but it is a hollow pursuit. The world of facts and logic I once inhabited seems a fragile facade, easily torn by the horrors that lurk just beyond our understanding. The Night Watchman Express still runs. I am sure of it. It continues its timeless journey through the shadowed corners of the land, its ageless attendants ensuring the rules are presented, the pact upheld. And I, am left with the chilling knowledge that I was a passenger, that I brushed against a darkness far older and more malevolent than I could have ever imagined. I followed the rules. For the most part, I did not open my door. I did not look out of the window when the coldness came. I covered the reflective surfaces. I did not touch any stain. And yet, the metallic taste sometimes returns, unbidden. A faint scent of rust and decay in an empty room. A fleeting glimpse of a pale, watching face in a crowd. A face that could belong to the attendant. Have I truly escaped? Or am I merely one of the changed, marked in a way I cannot yet perceive, my own vitality slowly, imperceptibly, being siphoned away? The rules are a shield, yes, but perhaps no shield is perfect against such an ancient and insidious power. I was a passenger on an overnight train. They had a strange set of rules, and I fear, with every fiber of my being, that my journey is not yet truly over. The night watchman always collects its due, one way or another. And the final stop is a destination I dare not contemplate. My name is Alistair Finch, and my professional life, if one could call it that, has largely been defined by quietude and the peculiar scent of places recently, and often hastily, vacated. I am, for lack of a more elegant term, a high-end caretaker, specializing in properties that require a discreet, long-term presence, often under circumstances their owners prefer not to dwell upon. It's a solitary existence, one that has honed my senses, and, I suppose, dulled my capacity for surprise. Or so I believed. I've occupied sprawling, silent manors haunted only by dust and memory, and modern architectural marvels, whose only flaw was an owner, too embroiled in scandal to enjoy them. Each assignment was a study in stillness, a vigil over the material remnants of lives interrupted. I was, in essence, a professional ghost, unseen, unheard, ensuring that the properties remained inviolate until their owners, or fate, decided their next chapter. The summons for the Montana assignment arrived via a third-party legal firm. As these things often do, a crisp, cream-colored envelope containing a contract sparse on details but excessively generous in compensation. The client, as expected, was anonymous, referred to only as the benefactor. The property was an estate named Blackwood Ridge, nestled deep within a sparsely populated region of Montana. My duties were vaguely defined: to maintain a presence, ensure the security of the main house and immediate grounds, and report any significant structural or environmental issues. The duration was 6 months, possibly longer. No mention was made of previous caretakers, nor any particular issues, beyond the inherent challenges of a remote location. The sum offered was enough to make me overlook the lack of transparency, a common enough trade, often my line of work. Perhaps there was a lingering legal dispute, a family squabble, or simply an owner who desired absolute privacy. My job wasn't to ask why, only to occupy. The journey to Blackwood Ridge was a descent into profound isolation. I flew into Missoula, then rented a sturdy 4F4. The drive began pleasantly enough, through rolling hills and picturesque valleys. But with each passing hour, civilization thinned. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to deeply rutted dirt tracks, that clawed their way through dense, towering forests of pine and fir. The last town, a place called Sparrow Creek, was little more than a cluster of weathered buildings huddled around a gas station and a general store. The air there already felt different, heavier, scented with damp earth and the perpetual twilight of the deep woods. I stopped for gas and supplies. The attendant, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh winters, eyed my vehicle, and then me with a couldn't quite decipher, not hostile, but guarded. Headed far up? He asked, his voice raspy. Blackwood Ridge, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the mountains that loomed like dark sentinels in the distance. That's a ways out. Not much company up there. Used to be a ranger station way back, and some old logging camps. Quiet now. Too quiet, some say. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Cryptic warnings from locals were practically a trope in these situations, usually amounting to nothing more than superstition or a desire to spook the outsider. Still, his words, too quiet, echoed in my mind as I drove on. The final stretch of the track was barely a suggestion of a road, the trees pressing in so close their branches scraped against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. Blackwood Ridge emerged from the gloom of the forest, not with a whisper but with a brooding sigh. The main house was a sprawling, two-story structure of dark timber, and its architecture a peculiar blend of rustic hunting lodge and Victorian Gothic. It possessed a kind of faded grandeur, but decay was visibly setting in paint, peeling from the window frames. A slight sag in one section of the porch roof, and an air of profound neglect despite its structural integrity. Several outbuildings, a stables, a workshop, what looked like a small, self-contained cottage stood further back, slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. The keys were not handed over by a departing representative. Instead, as per my emailed instructions, I found them in a magnetic lockbox, attached to the underside of a rusted weather vane atop a crumbling stone gatepost. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not a peaceful, pastoral silence, but a thick, watchful stillness that seemed to absorb sound. The air was cold even for late autumn, and carried the scent of pine needles and damp stone. As I stepped onto the porch, the heavy oak door creaking open before me, I had the distinct and unsettling sensation of being observed, not by eyes, but by the house itself, by the very trees that ringed the clearing. Inside, dust lay thick on everything, undisturbed for what looked like months, if not longer. Furniture, heavy and dark, was draped in white sheets, resembling a congregation of shrouded figures. The layout was labyrinthine, a confusing warren of rooms and corridors, many of which seemed to serve no discernible purpose. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was still turned to July of the previous year. Oddly, several interior doors, particularly those leading to a narrow hallway on the ground floor, were fitted with heavy deadbolts, some of which looked recently installed. More unnerving still, in what appeared to be a nursery on the second floor, The windows were boarded up not from the outside, but from within, the planks nailed crudely across the glass. Signs of a hasty, perhaps fearful, departure. I spent the first day methodically going about my routine, unpacking essential supplies, checking the generator, the water pump, and the satellite internet connection, surprisingly functional, though sluggish. I walked the perimeter of the main house and the immediate outbuildings, noting areas that would require attention. I tried to impose a sense of order, of normalcy, onto the oppressive atmosphere. Internally, I cataloged the estate's quirks, the unsettling stillness, the strange interior locks, as products of isolation, and perhaps the eccentricities of a previous occupant. Loneliness was a familiar companion in my work, and the initial grandeur of Blackwood Ridge, despite its decay, held a certain melancholic appeal. I told myself the feeling of being watched was simply my imagination adjusting to the profound solitude. The first night, however, the house began to breathe around me. I was in the large, vaulted living room, reading by the light of a propane lamp. The generator switched off to conserve fuel. Old houses settle, I know this. Timbers contract, floorboards creak. But these sounds were different. A distinct, rhythmic tapping seemed to emanate from within the walls of the western wing, a section of the house I had yet to fully explore. It would stop if I made a noise, then resume once silence returned. Later, as I lay in the master bedroom, a vast, cold chamber, I heard what sounded like a floorboard creaking in the hallway outside my door. I called out, but there was no reply. Only the oppressive silence rushing back in. I dismissed it as the house, the wind, my own tired mind. The next day, while poring over some old schematics of the estate, I found in a desk drawer, more out of a need to understand the sprawling layout than anything else, I noticed a faded, hand-drawn addition to the official survey map. Deep within the property lines, several miles from the main house, a small area was circled and labeled in faint pencil, "Old campsite, disused." The park ranger comment from the gas station attendant came back to me. Perhaps it was one of those old logging camps he'd mentioned. I felt a faint prickle of curiosity, quickly suppressed. My duties were confined to the main house and its immediate vicinity. That evening, the unsettling occurrences became less ambiguous. I had meticulously organized my small collection of reference books on a shelf in the study. When I returned after a brief walk outside to check the generator before nightfall, one book, a field guide to alpine flora, was lying open on the floor, its pages riffled as if by a sudden gust of wind. Though all windows were closed, I was certain I hadn't touched it. Later, a fleeting shadow danced in my peripheral vision as I passed the darkened doorway of the dining room. When I turned, there was nothing, just the sheet, draped table, and the cold, empty space. A sudden cold spot enveloped me in the hallway, near the bolted nursery door, so intense it raised gooseflesh on my arms, then vanished as quickly as it came. The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer a vague sensation, but a palpable pressure, as if unseen eyes were fixed on my every move, even through the solid walls. The third night brought the escalation I had subconsciously been dreading. I woke with a start, unsure what had disturbed me. The silence in the room was absolute, yet charged with an undeniable tension. Then I heard it, a sound that could not be rationalized away as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. It was a whisper, faint but distinct, seeming to come from the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. It wasn't words I could understand, more a sibilant, breathy murmur, like someone speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My heart hammered against my ribs. I strained my ears, every nerve ending screaming. The whispering stopped, replaced by a soft, deliberate scraping sound, like fingernails being drawn slowly across wood. Slowly, cautiously, I rose from the bed. My hand reaching for the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My professionalism, my carefully constructed composure, was beginning to crack. This wasn't the creak of an old house. This felt intentional. I moved towards the door, my breath held tight in my chest. The scraping stopped. I waited, listening. Silence. Then, from downstairs, came a single, resonant thud. Like something heavy being dropped, or a door slamming shut with immense force. I spent the rest of that night with my back against the headboard. Flashlight beam, cutting swaths through the oppressive darkness of the room. Every shadow seeming to writhe with unseen movement. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, trying to piece together logical explanations that felt increasingly flimsy. Animals. Unlikely to be so deliberate, so personal. A squatter. The remoteness made it improbable. And there were no signs of forced entry beyond what I'd initially observed. The following morning, bleary-eyed and on edge, I found all the interior doors. Along the ground floor, hallway, the ones with the heavy deadbolts, standing wide open. I had checked each one before retiring, ensuring they were closed, though I hadn't bothered with the bolts. Now, they gaped like empty mouths. My own travel mug, which I distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter, sat on the dusty, moth-eaten seat of a child's rocking chair in the boarded-up nursery, a room I had only glanced into on my first day and had no intention of revisiting. A cold dread, far deeper than simple unease, began to seep into my bones. I started documenting everything in a small notebook: the sounds, the moved objects, the times. I checked all exterior locks, wedged chairs under doorknobs. These were the actions of a man losing control, not a seasoned caretaker. My professional detachment was shattering, replaced by a primal, growing fear. The true turning point, the moment the title of this unfolding nightmare seared itself into my consciousness, came that afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, or perhaps to find something, anything, that could explain the escalating strangeness. I decided to investigate the source of the tapping sounds from the first night. The western wing. It was a part of the house. I'd avoided a maze of smaller, dustier rooms that felt even older and more neglected than the rest. In what might have once been a servant's quarters tucked away at the very end of a narrow, lightless corridor, I found it. Not a source of tapping, but something far more chilling. Scratched into the grimy surface of a window pane, almost invisible until the light caught it just so, was a single, frantically etched word, less 10, and beneath it, almost too faint to see, a crude drawing of a stick figure, running. Running from something outside the frame of the small, dirty pane. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. This was a warning, left by someone who had been here before me, someone who had clearly experienced something that terrified them. I backed away from the window, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer just watchful, but actively malevolent. I finally understood. I wasn't just watching over an estate. I was trapped inside something else entirely. Something was terribly wrong at Blackwood Ridge, and I had a horrifying suspicion that its attention was now turning fully towards me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes like skeletal applause, and for the first time in my solitary career, I felt utterly, hopelessly alone, and profoundly afraid. The breath hitched in my throat, a raw, painful gasp. Leston. The word was a command, a plea, a threat, all gouged into the filthy glass of the sunroom window. Beside it, a stick figure, crude and childlike, was frozen mid-sprint, arms flailing, legs pumping in a silent scream of escape. The image, combined with the single, stark word, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, colder and sharper than the Montana air that seeped persistently through the lodge's ancient window seals. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached out to touch the etching. It was surprisingly deep, not merely scratched but carved into the pane. The edges felt rough, almost jagged against my skin. It didn't feel ancient, not like something left decades ago to be discovered by chance. There was a rawness to it, a sense of immediacy. The dust around the carving was disturbed, yes, but not in a way that suggested it had just been made. It was more as if the dust had settled around the disturbance, accommodating it. The person who did this, they must have used something hard, something sharp, a rock, maybe a piece of metal. The force required, the sheer desperation implied by the crude lines, painted a horrifying picture of their state of mind. This wasn't a casual piece of vandalism. It was a testament, a frantic warning. I leaned closer, scrutinizing the running figure. It was angled away from the interior of the sunroom, as if fleeing out of the estate, or perhaps deeper into the oppressive woods that ringed the property. The posture was one of pure, unadulterated panic. Every line screamed terror. My mind, trained to seek logical explanations, scrambled for purchase. A prank. Local kids, perhaps, managing to bypass the locked gate and the miles of rough track. Highly unlikely. The remoteness of the Blackwood estate was its defining feature. A disgruntled former employee of Mr. Blackwood, leaving a cryptic message. More plausible, perhaps. But the visceral fear conveyed by that simple drawing felt far more primal than mere workplace dissatisfaction. Or was it exactly what it appeared to be, a warning left by someone who had experienced something here? Something that made them want to tell anyone who followed to listen and to run. I moved quickly, checking the other windows in the sunroom, then those in the adjoining library and drawing room. Nothing. No other marks. No other messages. Just this one window, this one chilling tableau. Why here? What was visible from this specific vantage point that had prompted such a desperate act? I peered out through the etched glass. The window offered a wide, unsettling panorama of the overgrown back lawn, which sloped down towards the dense, dark, and utterly silent tree line. The trees themselves seemed to press in, a wall of ancient sentinels. Whatever the previous occupant had seen or heard, it was likely out there, in that unnerving expanse. Or perhaps something from out there had been trying to get in, right through this very pane of glass. The window, a fragile barrier, had become a focal point of past terror, and now, a beacon of potential future threat for me. The word, Easton, seemed to throb in the dusty air, echoing in the sudden silence of my own thoughts. Compelled, almost against my better judgment, against the rising tide of instinct that screamed at me to get in the truck and drive, until Montana was a distant memory, I consciously tried to obey. I strained my ears, actively filtering out the low moan of the wind as it curled around the eaves of the old lodge, a sound that had, until moments ago, been a comforting backdrop of isolation. At first, there was only the familiar symphony of an old, empty house, the subtle creak and groan of settling timbers, the distant, dry rustle of unseen leaves skittering across a porch roof. But then, a shift, a profound change in the auditory landscape. The absence of sound became the most noticeable thing. The normal chorus of the forest, the chirping of birds, the busy chattering of squirrels, the drone of insect sounds I'd taken for granted, even in this remote location, seemed unnaturally muted, almost entirely gone. An oppressive, heavy silence blanketed the estate, a silence that felt profoundly wrong, like a held breath. It wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. It felt as if the very woods were holding their breath, cowed by something far more significant than my lone presence. I began to move through the cavernous lodge, my boots thudding unnaturally loudly on the polished wood floors. From the grand hall to the dusty dining room, then into the shadowy kitchen, the silence followed me, a palpable entity in itself. It was broken only by my own sounds, my footsteps, the catch of my breath, each one jarringly loud, an unwelcome intrusion into the unnatural stillness. Then I heard it. So faint, so subtle, I almost dismissed it as imagination, a product of my heightened senses, a rhythmic, soft thump. Or was it more of a drag? The ambiguity of the sound made it all the more unsettling. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the main staircase, or perhaps the floor above, the vast, unexplored territory of the second story. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy, swallowed instantly by the heavy quiet. There was no echo, no response. And then, the thumping or dragging stopped. Just like that. The silence rushed back in, now heavier, more watchful, as if whatever had made the sound was now aware of me, listening in turn. The fact that it reacted, that it stopped because of my call, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. It implied sentience, a consciousness that was now alerted to my awareness of it. I fumbled for the satellite phone Mr. Blackwood had insisted I carry. No signal, the screen declared, as it had since I'd passed through the main gates. The two-way radio he'd also provided, a heavy-duty piece of kit, crackled with an impenetrable wall of static, no matter which channel I selected. The isolation, which had initially felt like a peaceful perk of the job, now felt absolute, a tightening noose. A chilling curiosity, a morbid fascination intertwined with a primal urge to flee, began to war within me. The memory of that faint, responsive sound from upstairs gnawed at me. Despite every instinct screaming at me to barricade myself in a room, or better yet, make a run for the truck, I found myself drawn towards the grand staircase. I detoured to the massive stone fireplace in the main hall and grabbed the heavy iron poker. It was a meager weapon against the unknown, but its solid weight in my hand was a small comfort. As I ascended the creaking, ornate staircase, each step groaning under my weight, a distinct cold spot enveloped me on the first landing. It was a pocket of unnatural chill, so intense that my breath misted in the air before me. The temperature plummeted several degrees in the space of a few steps, the air growing clammy and still, then returned to the ambient cool of the old house as I moved past it. There was no draft, no open window to explain it. It was just there, a localized anomaly of cold. The upstairs hallway was long and shadowed, lined with closed doors, each one a potential Pandora's box. I chose one at random, my hand hesitating on the cold brass knob before turning it. A bedroom, opulent even in its decay, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in faded, once rich fabrics. Everything was coated in a thick, uniform layer of dust, the kind that speaks of years, decades even, of undisturbed neglect. Yet, in the very center of the dusty coverlet on the bed, there was a single, fresh indentation. It wasn't deep, more like a shallow depression, as if someone or something had been sitting there very recently. The outline was clear in the otherwise smooth expanse of dust. It was undeniably there, a stark contradiction to the ancient stillness of the room. A faint, musky, and slightly sweet odor permeated the air in this room, different from the general dry mustiness of the rest of the lodge. It was cloying and deeply unpleasant, making the hairs on the back of my neck prick out. I backed out, pulling the door shut, and moved to the next. A study. Here, the scene was one of disarray. Books were pulled haphazardly from the towering shelves, some lying open on the floor, their pages splayed as if hastily searched or scattered in a fit of rage or panic. Papers were strewn across a large mahogany desk and the surrounding carpet. This disturbance felt more recent, more violent, than the quiet indentation in the bedroom. One leather-bound volume lay conspicuously open on the floor, almost as if placed there. It was a book on local Montana folklore, and a particular passage was crudely circled with something dark and dried. It looked like mud, or perhaps, chillingly, old blood. My heart hammered as I read the circled words. Beware the things that listen from the trees, the spirits of the deep woods that hunger. They are the shadows that mimic, the whispers on the wind. The words resonated with a sickening clarity, connecting directly to the command on the window. I stir. And the running figure fleeing these very things. The temporal dissonance of the lodge was unnerving. Decades of undisturbed dust coexisting with these signs of very recent, very disturbing activity. It was as if the past and present were bleeding into one another, or that something ancient had been reawakened. An active, ongoing presence. Were these clues? The cold spot, the indentation, the specific odor. This circled passage, were they incidental by-products of whatever haunted this place, or were they something more deliberate? A warning, a taunt, a trail of breadcrumbs leading me deeper into the nightmare. As I stared at the circled passage, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed a door shut further down the hallway. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence, making me jump, the poker clattering against the floorboards as I fumbled it. The wind outside began to howl, rising in pitch and intensity, no longer a mournful moan, but an angry shriek. And carried on that wind, I heard it. Whispering. I strained to listen, the command from the window, a fresh imperative. This time, it wasn't a subtle thump or a dragging sound. Mixed with the keening of the wind, distinct and undeniable, were whispers. Indistinct at first, sibilant and insidious, like the rustling of dry snakeskin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, just at the very edge of my auditory perception. I stumbled to the nearest hallway window, peering out into the rapidly darkening afternoon. The sky was a bruised purple, gray. The trees at the edge of the property, the ones that formed that impenetrable wall, were swaying violently, their movements too erratic, too aggressive for the wind alone to account for. And then, for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, in the deepest shadows between two ancient, gnarled pines, I thought I saw movement. Something tall, unnaturally thin. A silhouette darker than the surrounding gloom that was there. And then it was gone, vanishing as quickly as I'd perceived it. I blinked, shaking my head, telling myself it was a trick of the light, the play of shadows and swaying branches, but the image was seared into my mind. The whispering intensified, growing louder, closer. It seemed to coalesce, the sibilant sounds now forming fragmented, broken words. I couldn't make them out clearly, not quite, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, filled with a chilling, predatory hunger. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was no longer subtle. The rational part of my brain, the part that had tried to find logical explanations for the etching, the silence, the indentation, was screaming, overwhelmed. The park ranger in me, the man trained with tangible dangers, wildfires, lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, was utterly adrift, useless against this intangible, insidious, and rapidly escalating threat. The phenomena were no longer ambiguous. They were a direct sensory assault. The very environment, the wind, the trees, seemed to be an extension of this malevolent presence, conduits for its voice and its fleeting, terrifying manifestations. The whispers seemed to be calling my name now, or a distorted, corrupted version of it. Alistair. A drawn-out, sibilant hiss that slithered into my ears. The sound seemed to be drawing me, pulling me towards a specific part of the lodge. My eyes were drawn to a dark, previously unnoticed narrow doorway at the far end of the upstairs hall. A space I hadn't registered before, cloaked in deep shadow. Or perhaps it was beckoning me towards the cellar, the thought of which sent a fresh wave of revulsion through me. An unnatural compulsion began to take root, a morbid curiosity hideously intertwined with sheer, gut-wrenching terror. I wanted to run, to scream, to barricade myself and wait for dawn. But an insidious part of me felt compelled to follow the sound, to see what awaited, to understand the source of this all-consuming dread. Ice 10. Command on the window had been an instruction. These whispers were a summons. Poker held high, its iron tip cold against my sweating palm. I took a single, hesitant step towards that shadowed doorway, towards the intensified whispering. The air around me grew colder still, the musky, sweet odor I'd noticed in the bedroom, now faintly present here too, stronger, more cloying. I stood at the threshold of this new, unknown area, the whispers swirling around me, a vortex of sibilant promises and unspoken threats. They promised something: knowledge, annihilation. They seemed to wreathe in the air, almost visible. I was faced with an impossible choice: retreat into the deceptive safety of the rooms behind me, a futile act given the pervasive nature of this haunting. Attempt to flee the estate, out into those listening woods where the tall, thin figure lurked. Or step forward, into the beckoning dark, to confront the source of the terror that had so utterly consumed the Blackwood estate. The whispers intensified, urging me on. The whispers had led me here, to this door. It was a dark stain in the dim hallway, a feature I could have sworn hadn't been there moments before. They weren't just sounds anymore, those insidious murmurings. They were a current, pulling me forward, promising something. Answers. Relief from the gnawing dread that had become my constant companion in this godforsaken Montana estate. I didn't know, but the pull was undeniable. My hand, sweat with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house, trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was old brass, and felt colder than any metal had a right to be, leaching warmth from my fingertips. A war raged in my head, one part the rational Alistair, the one who still clung to sanity by a thread, screamed at me to turn, to run, to get out of this house and never look back. "Flee!" it shrieked. This is how people die in stories. But another part, a darker, more insidious voice amplified by the chorus of whispers that now seemed to coil around me, like invisible serpents, was captivated. A perverse curiosity, a desperate need to understand the wrongness that permeated this place, had taken root. The whispers were seductive now, a siren song promising to unveil the mystery, to show me what lay at the heart of the terror. The air around the door was frigid, a stark contrast to the rest of the hallway. I ran my other hand over the wood. It felt wrong. Too smooth, like polished bone, yet with an underlying dampness that made my skin crawl. The whispers intensified. No longer just heard but felt. A low thrumming vibration in my chest, a building pressure behind my eyes. The oppressive silence of the rest of the sprawling mansion seemed to magnify them, making them the only tangible thing in my crumbling reality. I couldn't fight it. The compulsion was an iron band around my will, squeezing out every last drop of resistance. With a shuddering breath that felt like my last, I turned the knob. The click of the latch was obscenely loud in the silence, followed by a low, groaning creak as the door swung inward. The sound echoed, not just in the hallway, but somewhere deeper, resonating with an unnatural timbre that vibrated through the very foundations of the house and into my soul. This wasn't just opening a door. It was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. What greeted me wasn't a room I recognized from Mr. Blackwood's hurried tour. My flashlight beam, already struggling against the encroaching gloom of the estate, seemed to be swallowed whole by what lay beyond. It was a corridor, impossibly narrow and stretching into a darkness so profound it felt like a physical entity. The geometry of it was wrong, subtly skewed in a way that made my head spin and my stomach churn. It didn't belong here. It couldn't possibly fit within the known architecture of the house. A foul odor assaulted my nostrils, a cloying mix of damp earth, something metallic like old blood, and an underlying scent of decay that was both ancient and sickeningly fresh. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a hidden passage. It was an aberration, a cancerous growth within the house itself. The whispers surged, louder now, no longer seductive but filled with a cacophony of sibilant, eager voices. Mixed with them were new sounds, subtle at first, then growing more distinct, a faint, dry skittering, like insects with too many legs, and a wet, dragging noise that suggested something heavy and limp being pulled across a rough surface. A low, almost sub-audible hum vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in my teeth. The walls, if you could call them that, weren't wood or plaster. In the weak, flickering reach of my flashlight, they seemed to be made of something else. Dark, glistening, with a texture that looked disturbingly organic, as if I had stepped into the gullet of some colossal, unseen beast. The air was thick, heavy, and cold, a dead, stagnant cold that had nothing to do with a Montana winter. This place felt ancient, far older than the house, older than the mountains themselves. It was a wound in the world, and I had just stumbled into its festering depths. I wanted to turn, to slam the door shut and barricade it. But even as the thought formed, a chilling certainty settled over me. There was no going back. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The doorway, it wasn't there. Or perhaps it was, but it had blended seamlessly into the shifting, organic-looking wall, leaving no trace of its existence. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the dread. The whispers seemed to mock my terror, now actively pushing me forward, not with a physical touch, but with an undeniable psychic pressure that made my temples throb. I was trapped. My feet moved, clumsy and reluctant, carrying me deeper into the impossible corridor. As I stumbled onward, the weak beam of my flashlight picked out more details, each more horrifying than the last. The walls were covered in crude, spidery drawings, symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with a faint, internal luminescence in the periphery of my vision. They depicted forms that defied earthly biology, shapes that twisted the eye and mind. In alcoves that appeared and disappeared, with the shifting geometry of the passage, I saw piles of bones, small, delicate things. Not human, thank God, but arranged in bizarre, ritualistic patterns that spoke of a terrible, alien intellect. The skittering and dragging sounds grew closer. I could hear them behind me, then to the sides, as if whatever made them was flanking me, hurting me. A primal fear, the kind that bypasses thought and goes straight for the spine, told me I was being watched by countless unseen eyes, studied by something ancient and malevolent. The whispers began to coalesce, the sibilant chorus resolving into distinct, chilling phrases. They weren't in English, not quite, but the meaning bled through. Raw and terrifying fragments of a history, steeped in blood and madness, promises of agonizing revelation, declarations of an insatiable, eternal hunger. This was it. This was the triblywrog I had felt setting foot on this cursed estate. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was something far older, far more fundamental, a presence, an entity, a force that had claimed this land, this house, and was now reaching out for me. The air grew heavier, the silence between the whispers more profound, more laden with unspoken threat. The corridor finally opened into a space. I hesitate to call it a chamber. It was vast, far larger than any room in the house could possibly be. The oppressive darkness was thicker here, almost liquid, and my flashlight beam was a pathetic, dying ember against it. In the center, or what I perceived as the center in the disorienting, non-Euclidean space, there was something. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood, not as I understood it. It was a vortex of shifting shadows, a churning mass of impossible angles and broken light, a place where the fabric of reality itself seemed to have been torn open and was bleeding into our world. It pulsed with a lightless energy, and the whispers emanated from it, a deafening torrent of alien thought and raw, unadulterated malice. I couldn't scream. The sound died in my throat, a strangled gasp. My muscles locked, my mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the sheer, mind-breaking alienness of what I was witnessing. This was the source, the heart of the wrongness. It felt me, I knew it did. A wave of nauseating cold washed over me, accompanied by a barrage of horrific images that flashed through my mind, aeons of cosmic dread. Civilizations crumbling into dust, stars dying, the universe itself screaming in silent agony. It wasn't just seeing it, it was knowing it, a truth so vast and terrible it threatened to shatter my sanity into a million pieces. The shadows wreathed, coalescing, reaching. I felt a pull, not physical, but essential, as if my very soul was being drawn towards that churning abyss. It wanted to consume me, to absorb me, to make me part of its ancient, terrible existence. I squeezed my eyes shut, a futile gesture against a horror that was already seared onto my brain. I think I might have babbled then, prayed to any god that might be listening, though I knew, with a chilling certainty, that no benevolent deity held sway in this place. Then something shifted. A sound, a tearing, ripping noise, not from the entity, but from somewhere else, somewhere within the house itself. Or was it within me? I don't know. There was a sudden, violent pressure, an expulsion. One moment I was on the precipice of annihilation. The next I was tumbling, falling. The oppressive darkness receding, replaced by dim, familiar light. I landed hard on a wooden floor, the air knocked from my lungs. I lay there gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. I was in the main hallway of the Blackwood estate, near the grand staircase. The dark door was gone. The corridor, the chamber, the entity, all vanished as if they had never been. Sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the dusty windows. How did I get here? I had no memory of escaping, no recollection of the journey back from that abyss. One moment I was facing oblivion, the next I was here. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady. I didn't stop to think, to question. I ran. I burst out of the front door, into the cold Montana air, and didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until the accursed estate was miles behind me. I never returned. I never collected my final paycheck. I left Montana and never spoke of what happened in that house, not to a living soul. Not until now. But it's not over. Not really. The estate might be behind me, but the experience, it changed me. I bear scars no doctor can see. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear them. Faint. So faint I almost convince myself it's the wind, or the ringing in my ears. The whispers. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, in the deep shadows of my own eyes, I see a flicker of that impossible geometry, a hint of the vast, cold darkness I witnessed. It's a terrifying thought, one that keeps me awake more nights than I can count. Maybe I didn't entirely escape. Maybe a part of that wrongness, a tiny, insidious seed, came back with me. My name is Arthur Jennings. Prior to the events I am about to recount, I considered myself a man of logic, a scholar of observable phenomena, and a firm believer in the rational. I held a modest professorship in ancient history at a respected, albeit not overly prestigious, university. My life was one of dusty tomes, cataloged artifacts, and the comforting predictability of academic routine. The notion of demons, hell, or any realm beyond the tangible was, to me, the stuff of folklore. Fascinating from a historical perspective, but utterly divorced from reality. I state this plainly so that you, the reader, may understand the profound and terrifying dislocation I experienced when my meticulously ordered world was irrevocably shattered. It began on a Tuesday, a day usually characterized by a late afternoon seminar on Mesopotamian deities, a subject I now view with a chillingly different perspective. I had been working late in my office, a cramped space overflowing with books and maps, a haven of intellectual pursuit. The campus was quiet, the usual hum of student activity, long since faded into the evening. I recall a peculiar stillness in the air, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the usual city, sounds that drifted in from outside my window. A headache had been plaguing me for most of the afternoon, a dull throb behind my temples that I attributed to stress and lack of sleep. as I was packing my briefcase, preparing to leave. The headache intensified with alarming speed. It wasn't a gradual worsening, it was a sudden, brutal spike of pain that buckled my knees and sent a wave of nausea through me. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring. I remember reaching out to steady myself on my desk, my fingers knocking over a stack of research papers. The last thing I saw before consciousness deserted me was the faded cover of a book on Sumerian exorcism rituals, its title seeming to mock my impending fate. When I awoke, it was not the familiar surroundings of my office or a hospital bed, as one might logically expect. The air was the first thing that struck me, thick, acrid, and carrying a coppery tang that reminded me of old blood. It burned my nostrils and coated the back of my throat. My head was still throbbing, but a different kind of pain now, a heavy, disoriented ache. I was lying on a cold, unyielding surface, rough and uneven beneath my back. Slowly I forced my eyes open. The light was dim, a sickly, greenish-yellow luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very stones that formed the walls around me. I was in a cell. Not a modern prison cell with steel bars, a porcelain toilet, but something ancient, something primal. The walls were constructed of massive, roughly hewn blocks of a dark, volcanic-looking rock, slick with moisture and emitting a faint, unsettling warmth. There were no windows, no visible source of the grotesque light. The only break in the oppressive stone was a heavy, iron-banded wooden door, its surface scarred and pitted. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of my composure. I sat up, my body stiff and sore. My clothes, my tweed jacket and corduroy trousers, feeling absurdly out of place in this nightmarish environment. Where was I? How had I gotten here? My mind, usually a well-ordered library of facts and deductions, was a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. Hello. I called out, my voice raspy and weak. It was absorbed by the stone, a pathetic sound in the vast, oppressive silence. I tried again, louder this time. Is anyone there? A sound answered me then, but it was not human. It was a grating, scraping noise, like stone grinding against stone, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled backwards, pressing myself against the cold, damp wall, my eyes fixed on the door. The door creaked open, not with the sound of anoiled hinges, but with a sickening, wet-tearing sound, as if sinew and muscle were being rent. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against a slightly brighter, but equally repulsive, green glow from beyond, was a figure that defied all rational explanation. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs elongated and distorted. Its skin, where visible, was the color of bruised plums, stretched taut over sharp, angular bones. Horns thick and black as obsidian curled back from its brow, and its eyes, I will never forget those eyes, were pits of burning crimson, radiating an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It wore what looked like crudely fashioned armor of blackened metal, and in one clawed hand, it gripped a whip, its lashes tipped with what looked like jagged barbs of bone. This was no man in a costume, no product of a deranged mind. This was a demon, The word, once a mere entry in my lexicon of mythology, now held a terrifying, visceral reality. The creature let out another growl, a sound that seemed to dredge up the very essence of despair, and gestured with its free hand, a clear command for me to exit the cell. Fear, raw and primal, threatened to paralyze me, but some instinct for self-preservation, however faint, urged me to comply. To resist, I knew with chilling certainty, would be to invite unimaginable pain. I rose on trembling legs, my gaze fixed on the monstrous being before me. As I stepped out of the cell, the corridor beyond was revealed. It was a vast, cavernous space, stretching into the gloom further than my eyes could discern. The same sickly green light illuminated rows of identical cells, each with its heavy, dark door. The air was even fuller here, thick with the stench of sulfur, decay, and something else. Something uniquely terrifying that I couldn't quite place: the smell of absolute hopelessness. Other figures, similar to my escort, but with variations in their grotesque forms, some scaled, some winged, some with multiple eyes or limbs, patrolled the corridor, their clawed feet clicking ominously on the stone floor. They paid me little heed, their attention focused on their grim duties. And then I saw the other prisoners. They were human, or at least they had been. Gaunt, hollow-eyed figures, clad in rags, were being herded along by the demonic guards. Their faces were masks of terror and despair, their bodies often bearing the marks of horrific abuse. Some were weeping openly. Others shuffled along in a state of numb shock. The sight of them, their shared humanity in this infernal place, struck me with a fresh wave of horror. This was not a solitary nightmare. It was a collective one. My demonic guard nudged me forward of the sharp of its whip handle, the bone tip digging painfully into my shoulder. I stumbled, catching myself before I fell, and began to walk, joining the miserable procession. The corridor seemed endless. The only sounds were the shuffling of feet, the occasional sob, the guttural commands of the guards, and the distant, echoing screams that seemed to be a permanent fixture of this hellish soundscape. After what felt like an eternity, we were herded into a vast, circular chamber. The ceiling was so high it was lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with more cells, stacked one atop the other like a monstrous honeycomb. In the center of the chamber was a raised dais, upon which sat a figure even more imposing than the guards. It was massive, its bulk spilling over the edges of a throne, like chair carved from what looked like polished bone. Its skin was the color of congealed blood, and a pair of immense, leathery wings, like those of a bat, were folded behind it. Its face was a terrifying tableau of cruelty, with a wide, fang-filled maw, and eyes that burned with a cold, calculating malice. This, I surmised, was a being of some authority. A hush fell over the assembled prisoners as the seated demon raised a clawed hand. Its voice, when it spoke, was not a guttural growl, but a surprisingly articulate, though deeply resonant and chilling, baritone. The words it spoke were not in any human tongue. I recognized, yet, terrifyingly, I understood them. It was as if the meaning was imprinted directly onto my consciousness. New arrivals. It boomed, its crimson eyes sweeping over us. "Welcome to your eternal residence. You have been judged, found wanting, and delivered unto our care." A cruel smirk twisted its lips. "Here, you will learn the true meaning of penance." It then proceeded to lay out what it called the rules of subsistence. These were not rules designed for rehabilitation or order in the human sense. They were a set of arbitrary and cruel edicts, seemingly designed to maximize suffering and extinguish hope. "Roll 1. The demon declared, its voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Obedience is absolute. The slightest infraction will be met with swift and imaginative correction." It gestured with a claw, and from the shadows, another demon dragged forward a wretched soul who was screaming and struggling. With a casual flick of its wrist, the seated demon unleashed a thin whip of what looked like black fire, which lanced out and struck the prisoner. The scream was cut short, replaced by a horrifying, sizzling sound. The prisoner collapsed, smoking and twitching. My stomach churned. This was a place where the laws of physics, of biology, of everything I had ever known, were perverted and twisted to serve an agenda of pure, unadulterated evil. Rule 2. The demon continued, its gaze lingering on the smoldering form on the floor. "Sustenance is earned, not given. You will work. The nature of your labor will be varied." Another cruel smile. "Failure to meet quotas will result in deductions from your already meager rations." Rule 3. Hope is a contraband. Do not cling to it. It will only make your stay more uncomfortable. Rule 4. Communication between inmates is discouraged. Your only meaningful interactions will be with your overseers. Rule 5. The hierarchy is immutable. You are the lowest. We are your masters. Understand this, and your suffering, while guaranteed, may be predictable. There were more rules, each more draconian and soul-crushing than the last. They spoke of forbidden zones, of specific times when movement was restricted, of the absolute authority of even the meanest of the demonic guards. It was a charter for a society built on pain and fear. As the litany of rules concluded, a wave of despair, so profound it was almost a physical force, washed over me. My academic mind, usually so adept at analysis and problem-solving, felt utterly useless. How could logic prevail against such beings, in such a place? This wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a sentence to be endured. The prisoners, myself included, were then roughly divided into groups and led away by different guards, presumably to our assigned work or holding areas. The demon on the throne watched us go, its eyes glinting with a satisfaction that was utterly chilling. My journey into hell had truly begun, and the rules for survival, if survival was even possible, were stark, brutal, and seemingly designed to break not just the body, but the spirit itself. My name is Arthur Jennings, and this is the testimony of how I was taken to a prison run by demons, and the rules I had to learn to even begin Hen the Nightmare I was now a part of. The group I was herded into consisted of perhaps 24 souls, a motley collection of terror-stricken individuals whose previous lives were impossible to guess from their current wretched state. Our demonic escort, a hulking brute, with skin like charred leather, and a maw filled with needle, sharp teeth, prodded us relentlessly down a labyrinthine series of corridors. The sickly green luminescence persisted, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air grew hotter, thicker, and the metallic tang of blood became more pronounced, mingled now with the unmistakable stench of burning flesh. We were led into a vast, cavernous chamber, even larger than the one where the rules had been proclaimed. The heat here was intense, emanating from a series of deep pits that glowed with an infernal red light, scattered across the chamber floor. The purpose of these pits became horrifyingly clear as we drew closer. Suspended above each pit by thick, rusted chains were massive iron cauldrons bubbling with some viscous, dark liquid that emitted noxious fumes. The work, it seemed, involved these grotesque apparatuses. Our guard, whom I mentally began to refer to as Gringnash, due to the constant, rasping sound it made, gestured towards a pile of what looked like enormous, obsidian black bellows. "Stoke the fires," it growled, the words again imprinting themselves directly into my mind. The master requires his brew. The labor was as brutal as it was pointless, or so it seemed to my uninitiated eyes. We were to operate the bellows, pumping air into the glowing pits to keep the fires beneath the cauldrons at a roaring intensity. The bellows were incredibly heavy, designed for creatures of far greater strength than any human. Each downward thrust required the combined effort of 2 or 3 prisoners, our muscles screaming in protest, our hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. The heat was unbearable, searing our skin and lungs. Sweat poured from us, mingling with the grime and filth that coated the stone floor. The demonic overseers, several of them now patrolling the chamber, offered no respite. They moved among us like predatory animals, their crimson eyes missing nothing. Any sign of faltering, any hesitation, was met with a swift lash of their barbed whips. I saw a man beside me, his face pale and drawn, stumble from exhaustion. Before he could recover, a whip cracked across his back, tearing through his ragged shirt and drawing a thin line of blood. He cried out, a choked, desperate sound, but scrambled back to the bellows, his eyes wide with terror. Rule 1: obedience is absolute. The demonstration in the orientation chamber had not been an idle threat. The sustenance, when it eventually came, was a mockery of the term. Once what passed for a day, cycle here had ended, though how time was measured in this sunless realm, I could not fathom. We were herded into a smaller alcove. A trough, carved from the same dark stone as the walls, was filled with a gray, lumpy gruel. It smelled faintly of decay and something acrid, like spoiled chemicals. There were no bowls, no utensils. We were forced to scoop it up with our bare, filthy hands, jostling each other like starving animals. The degradation was as potent as the hunger. Rule 2: sustenance is earned. And what we earned was barely enough to keep us functioning for the next cycle of torment. Communication, as decreed by Rule 4, was indeed discouraged and effectively impossible. The guards were ever watchful, and the sheer terror of our situation, combined with the crushing labor, left little energy or inclination for conversation. Yet, in the shared misery, unspoken bonds formed. A fleeting glance of shared despair, a subtle shift to help another struggling with the bellows, a silent acknowledgement of another's pain. These were tiny, almost imperceptible acts of humanity in a realm designed to extinguish it. They were dangerous, these small rebellions of the spirit, but they were all we had. I tried to apply my academic mind to the situation, to find some pattern, some logic in the madness. It was a futile exercise. The demon's cruelty was not systematic in any way I could discern. It was capricious, arbitrary. One moment, a guard might ignore a clear infraction. The next, it would unleash a torrent of violence for no apparent reason. The rules were absolute, yet their application seemed to depend entirely on the whim of the individual demon enforcing them. This inconsistency was, perhaps, an even greater torment than predictable brutality. It kept us perpetually on edge, never knowing what might provoke their wrath. One cycle, while toiling at the bellows, I dared to observe Grignash more closely. Its movements, while brutish, had a certain rhythm. It patrolled a specific area, its gaze lingering on certain prisoners more than others. Was there a hierarchy even among these guards? Did some hold more sway, more power to inflict pain? Rule 5, the hierarchy is immutable. We were the lowest, that much was clear. But understanding their internal dynamics, if any existed, seemed a distant and perilous prospect. The nature of the brew we were heating remained a horrifying mystery. Sometimes other demons, more robed and seemingly of a different caste, would approach the cauldrons and ladle out portions of the bubbling liquid into ornate, obsidian flagons. They would then carry these away, disappearing into shadowed archways that led to unknown parts of the prison. What was its purpose? A potion? A fuel? A perverse form of sustenance for the higher echelons of demonkind? The questions gnawed at me, but answers were a luxury this place did not afford. Days, or cycles, bled into one another, a monotonous blur of agonizing labor, gnawing hunger and ever-present fear. The physical toll was immense. My body, once accustomed to the sedentary life of a scholar, was a canvas of aches, bruises, and open sores. My tweed jacket and corduroys were long since reduced to tattered rags, offering little protection against the harsh environment or the casual cruelty of the guards. But it was the psychological erosion that was most insidious. Rule 3: hope is a contraband, and the demons were experts at its confiscation. Every small spark of defiance I witnessed in others was brutally extinguished. Every fleeting moment of shared humanity felt like a transgression punishable by unimaginable torments. The constant, distant screams that echoed through the prison served as a perpetual reminder of the consequences of any deviation from abject submission. I found myself clinging to the remnants of my former self, to the analytical processes that had once defined me. I began to count. I counted the number of thrusts of the bellows between guard patrols. I counted the number of prisoners in my work group who collapsed each cycle. I counted the cracks in the stone floor of my cell. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos, to to find some small, predictable element in a universe of malevolent caprice. It wasn't hope, not in the traditional sense. It was a lifeline, a way to keep my mind from completely unraveling. One cycle, during the brief period of rest, in our cramped sleeping quarters, a bare stone floor, shared with dozens of other broken souls, I noticed something. A faint scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the other side of the wall I was leaning against. It was almost imperceptible amidst the snores, whimpers, and occasional mad ramblings of the other prisoners. But it was there. Scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. My heart, a dull, tired organ, gave a small, unexpected flutter. Was it another prisoner? Was it some creature indigenous to this hell? Or was it merely the settling of the ancient stones? Rule 4 forbade communication, and the risk of investigating was immense. Yet the sound, so out of place in the cacophony of despair, was a tiny anomaly, a deviation from the crushing norm. My logical mind, starved for stimulus, latched onto it. It was a puzzle, a minute variable in an equation of unending suffering. I didn't dare make a sound in response, not yet. The fear was too deeply ingrained. But as I lay there, listening to that faint, persistent scratching, a new, terrifying thought began to form, not of hope, but of a desperate, dangerous curiosity. What if, even in this meticulously crafted hell, there were whispers that the demons did not control? What if the rules, as absolute as they seemed, had cracks? The thought was perilous, a potential path to even greater suffering. But in a place designed to extinguish all thought, beyond immediate survival, it was also the first truly independent idea I had entertained since my arrival. The scratching continued, a tiny, insistent rhythm in the heart of the inferno, and I knew, with a cold dread, that my academic curiosity, the very trait that had defined my former life, might now be the catalyst for my ultimate damnation, or, perhaps, something else entirely. The path ahead was shrouded in deeper darkness than I could have ever imagined. The decision to investigate the scratching sound was not one I made lightly. Every instinct, honed by cycles of terror and torment, screamed against it. Rule 4, communication between inmates is discouraged. The word discouraged was a demonic euphemism for punishable by methods that would make a vivisectionist blanch. Yet, the sound persisted, a tiny, rhythmic anomaly in the symphony of suffering, and my mind, starved for any semblance of intellectual engagement, fixated on it. It was a gamble, a potentially fatal one, but the alternative, an eternity of mindless labor and crushing despair, was a slow death of the soul. During the brief, chaotic period when we were herded back to our communal sleeping chamber, after a cycle of stoking the infernal cauldrons, I maneuvered myself to the same spot against the wall. The scratching began again, faint but unmistakable. Scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the mysterious sound. How to respond? A direct sound, a tap, a whisper, was too risky. The demonic guards, like Gringnash, possessed preternaturally sharp senses. I needed something subtle, something that could be dismissed as accidental if observed. My eyes scanned the grimy stone floor. Amongst the filth and debris, I spotted a small, loose pebble, no bigger than my thumbnail. Waiting for a moment when the nearest guard seemed distracted, its multifaceted eyes scanning a different section of the crowded chamber, I subtly shifted my position. With infinite care, I nudged the pebble with the toe of my ragged boot, causing it to scrape lightly against the wall, mimicking the sound I had heard. One scrape, I held my breath. A pause from the other side, longer than usual. Had I been heard, or had I imagined the whole thing? My sanity finally succumbing to the horrors of this place. Then it came scratch, scratch. Two distinct sounds. A wave of something akin to exhilaration, quickly tempered by icy fear, washed over me. It was a response. Deliberate. Someone was there. Someone was communicating. Over the next few cycles, this clandestine, perilous dialogue continued. A pattern emerged. One scratch from my side, two in response. Two from me, one in return. It was a rudimentary code. A binary system born of desperation. We couldn't convey complex ideas, but we could confirm presence, acknowledge awareness. It was a lifeline, thinner than a spider's silk, but a lifeline nonetheless in an ocean of hopelessness. The identity of my unseen correspondent remained a mystery. Were they an old prisoner? Someone who had learned the subtle arts of survival in this hell? Or someone new, as terrified and disoriented as I was? The questions burned in my mind, but I dared not escalate our communication beyond the simple scratches. The work at the cauldrons continued, each cycle more grueling than the last. The brew remained an enigma, its acrid fumes a constant assault on our lungs. I observed the robed demons who collected it, their movements precise and ritualistic. They never spoke, their faces hidden in the deep cowls of their robes. They seemed different from the brutish guards, possessing an aura of cold, intellectual malevolence rather than raw, physical threat. Rule 5. The hierarchy is immutable. These robed figures were clearly higher in the demonic pecking order. One cycle, a new horror was introduced. One of the prisoners, a young woman whose name I never knew, collapsed at the bellows, her body racked with convulsions. Instead of the usual whipping, two of the robed demons approached. They carried with them a strange apparatus, a collection of gleaming, metallic instruments that looked disturbingly like surgical tools, but twisted into nightmarish forms. What followed was not a punishment, but an experiment. I will not recount the details, for they are seared into my memory with a clarity that still brings bile to my throat. Suffice it to say, her screams added a new, terrible layer to the prison's soundscape, and the robed demons observed her suffering with a detached, scientific curiosity. It was a chilling reminder that the cruelty here was not always born of rage, but sometimes of cold, calculated intent. The incident solidified my resolve. The scratching on the wall was more than just a curiosity. It was a potential, however slim, to find something, anything. Beyond this cycle of torment and observation, the opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly. During one rest period, a fight broke out amongst some prisoners over a scrap of moldy bread someone had managed to hoard. The guards descended with predictable brutality, their whips cracking, their guttural roars filling the chamber. In the ensuing chaos, with the guards' attention diverted, I saw my chance. My correspondent had, in previous conversations, begun a new pattern: 3 scratches, a pause, then 1. I had tentatively interpreted this as a question or an invitation. Now, with the guards occupied, I risked a more direct approach. I pressed my ear to the cold stone, straining to hear anything beyond the immediate din. A whisper, so faint it was almost lost in the cacophony. Careful, they listen. My blood ran cold. The voice was raspy, weak, but undeniably human, and it knew about the guards. Taking an immense risk, I whispered back, my lips almost touching the stone. "Who are you?" A long pause. The sounds of the fight were dying down, the guards dragging away the unfortunate brawlers. Any moment, their attention could return. "A survivor," the voice finally came, "like you. For now." Another pause. "The walls have ears and teeth." Before I could respond, a shadow fell over me. Grignash. Its crimson eyes bored into me. Its lipless maw curled into something that might have been a sneer. My heart leaped into my throat. Had it heard? It merely grunted. However, we soon discovered why. With its whip handle towards the center of the room, where the other prisoners were being forced to kneel. The moment had passed. But the words resonated. The walls have ears and teeth. It wasn't just the guards we had to fear. The very structure of this prison was an enemy. Over the subsequent cycles, our whispered exchanges became slightly more daring, always conducted during moments of distraction, always brief, always terrifying. I learned that my correspondent's name was Alara. She had been in this hell for a period she could no longer accurately measure. Too many cycles to count. She'd whispered. She had seen countless souls broken, consumed, or simply vanish. Alara possessed a wealth of grim knowledge. She knew the patrol patterns of certain guards, the subtle signs that preceded a culling, a term that made my stomach clench, and, most importantly, she knew that the rules, while seemingly absolute, were sometimes bent by the demons themselves for their own inscrutable purposes or due to their own internal rivalries. They are not a monolith. Arthur, she whispered one cycle, her voice barely audible above the distant screams. There are factions, power struggles. The master on the throne is not the only power here. There are older things, deeper things. This was a revelation. My academic mind, accustomed to analyzing power, structures, and historical conflicts, seized upon this. If the demons were not united, could that be exploited? It was a dangerous thought, a spark of something that felt dangerously like the contraband hope. Alara also spoke of the quiet places, hidden, forgotten corners of the prison where the guards rarely patrolled, where one might find a moment's respite. Or even, she hinted, something more. But reaching them was a perilous undertaking, requiring knowledge of the prison's ever shifting layout and a suicidal degree of courage. There are ways out of the common paths, she breathed, her words sending a shiver down my spine. Tunnels, forgotten by most. But they are not safe. Other things dwell there. Things even the guards fear. The brew, we toiled over, Elara confirmed, was indeed a source of power for the demons, but also a volatile substance. It fuels their magic, their strength, she explained, but it is also unstable. Mishandle it and the results are explosive. This, too, lodged in my mind, a piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to comprehend. Our clandestine communication was not without its near disasters. Once, a lesser demon, a wiry, bat-winged creature, seemed to pause too long near our section of the wall, its head cocked as if listening. Elara and I froze, the silence stretching for an agonizing eternity before it finally moved on. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my gut. As I pieced together Elara's fragmented whispers, a terrifying, desperate idea began to form in my mind. It was an insane gamble, a plan so audacious that its failure would undoubtedly result in a fate worse than anything I had yet experienced. But the alternative was to remain a cog in this infernal machine, stoking the fires of my own damnation until my body or mind finally gave out. Elara had spoken of a particular robed demon, one she called the alchemist, who was responsible for overseeing the quality of the brew. This alchemist was said to be meticulous, almost obsessive, and possessed a private chamber near the great cauldron hall, a place rumored to contain notes, perhaps even formulas related to the brew. If I could reach that chamber, if I could find something, anything, that could be used. The thought was incomplete, a wild, untamed seed of rebellion, but it was there. The path ahead was no longer just about enduring the rules. It was about understanding them, twisting them, and perhaps, just perhaps, finding a way to break them, even if it meant walking directly into the jaws of a deeper, more terrifying darkness. The scratching on the wall had opened a door, not to escape, but to a new, more perilous level of the game. And I, Arthur Jennings, the scholar of ancient history, was about to embark on the most dangerous research project of my life, with my sanity and my very soul as the stakes. The next cycle, I decided, I would ask Elara about the alchemist's chamber. The quiet rhythm of the prison continued, but for me, something had irrevocably shifted. The path of mere survival was no longer enough.